The invisible force directing your life. Picture this. You are standing at the edge of your own life, looking back at every decision that brought you here. The jobs you took, the relationships you stayed in, the opportunities you let slip through your fingers like sand. The moments you froze when you should have spoken, and the moments you spoke when you should have listened. And as you look back, a question rises in your chest, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. What if none of it was random? What if every outcome in your life, every single one, was the direct result of where you placed your attention? You did not choose your circumstances. Nobody does. But somewhere along the way, without ever signing a contract or reading the fine print, you handed over the steering wheel of your life to something invisible. A force so quiet, you rarely notice it working, yet so powerful that it has shaped every relationship you have built, every dollar you have earned or lost, every dream you have chased or abandoned. That force is your focus. And right now, in this very moment, it is either building the life you want or quietly dismantling it, one distracted second at a time. Stop for a moment and think about your phone, not as a device, but as a mirror. Every time you pick it up without thinking, you are watching your own mind in action, watching where your attention naturally drifts when nothing is holding it in place. Is it pulled toward growth or toward noise, toward your goals or toward the next flicker of entertainment? This is not a question about technology. This is a question about who is in control. You, or the 1,000 tiny interruptions competing for the most valuable resource you will ever own. Here is the truth nobody tells you early enough in life. Your thoughts are not random sparks firing in a vacuum. They are seeds. And seeds, whether you plant them on purpose or by accident, will grow into something. The mind does not stay empty. If you do not deliberately decide what occupies your attention, something else will decide for you. Advertisers will decide for you. Algorithms will decide for you. Anxious thoughts left unchecked since childhood will decide for you. The question has never been whether your mind will be filled. The question is, who gets to fill it? Think back to a moment when you accomplished something that genuinely mattered to you. Maybe it was finishing a difficult project, repairing a broken relationship, or pushing through a physical challenge you once thought impossible. Try to remember what your mind was doing in the hours before that breakthrough. Chances are, you were not scattered. You were not checking notifications every 90 seconds. You were locked in, present, singular in purpose. For that window of time, your focus narrowed like a beam of light through a magnifying glass, and that concentrated energy is what allowed you to burn through resistance that would have stopped a distracted mind cold. Now think of the opposite. A time when you wanted something badly, but somehow weeks turned into months and months turned into years, and the goal never moved an inch closer. What was happening in your mind during that stretch of time? If you are honest with yourself, you will likely discover the same pattern that exists in almost everyone who feels stuck. Not a lack of ability, not a lack of desire, a lack of directed, sustained focus. Your attention was scattered across a dozen shallow streams instead of carving one deep river. This is the principle this entire book is built around, and it deserves to be said plainly before we go any further. Where focus goes, power flows. Wherever you consistently place your attention, energy follows, resources follow, growth follows. And just as powerfully, wherever you allow your attention to leak away, your energy leaks away with it. This is not motivational language meant to sound inspiring on a poster. This is closer to a law of nature, observable in the life of every person who has ever achieved something extraordinary, and equally observable in the life of every person who has watched their potential quietly evaporate. Consider how an artist transforms a blank canvas into something that moves people to tears, or how an entrepreneur turns a single idea scribbled on a napkin into a company that changes an entire industry. Strip away the surface details and you will find the same underlying mechanism at work every single time. Concentrated attention, applied consistently, over time, toward a clearly defined target. That is the engine. Everything else, the talent, The luck, the timing, is secondary. Concentrated focus is the primary fuel. You might be wondering why, if this principle is so simple, so few people seem to apply it. The answer is not complicated, but it is uncomfortable. Focus is simple to understand and extraordinarily difficult to practice because everything in the modern world is engineered to fracture it. You are living in the most distraction-saturated era in human history. Every app on your phone has been built by teams of brilliant people whose entire job is to capture and hold your attention longer than you intended to give it. Every notification, every auto-playing video, every infinite scroll feed has been calibrated, tested, and refined to exploit the same psychological vulnerabilities that once helped your ancestors survive in the wild. The instinct that once kept early humans alive by noticing every rustle in the grass is now being hijacked by a red notification badge on an app icon. This is the silent war you are fighting every single day, whether you realize it or not. It is not a war against other people. It is not even, fundamentally, a war against technology. It is a war for ownership of your own mind. And the prize for winning this war is not a small one. The prize is your career, your relationships, your health, your sense of peace, your legacy. Everything you will ever build in this life will be built using the currency of your attention, and right now, that currency is being spent in places you would never choose if you stopped to think about it. Let's talk about something that might feel uncomfortably familiar. Have you ever sat down with the genuine intention to work on something important, something that actually mattered to your future, only to find yourself, 20 minutes later, scrolling through content you cannot even remember? Have you ever lain awake at night replaying a conversation from years ago, a moment of embarrassment or rejection, turning it over and over in your mind, even though there is nothing left to do about it? Have you ever found yourself irritated, anxious, or exhausted without being able to point to any single event that caused it? If any of this sounds familiar, you are not broken. You are not lazy. You are not lacking discipline in some fundamental, irreversible way. You are simply experiencing what every human being experiences when their focus has not been trained, directed, and protected. An untrained mind behaves exactly like an untrained dog. It pulls toward whatever smells most interesting in the moment, regardless of where you actually wanted to walk. The good news, and this is the heartbeat of everything you are about to learn, is that focus can be trained. It can be strengthened. It can be redirected with the same intentionality you would use to train any other skill, because that is precisely what it is. A skill. Not a fixed trait you were born with or without. This book exists because of a belief that runs counter to a popular myth in our culture. The myth says that some people are simply born focused, disciplined, and driven, while others are born scattered, distracted, and unmotivated, and that this is largely fixed for life. That myth is not only false, it is dangerous, because it gives people permission to stop trying. The truth is far more empowering, even if it is also more demanding. Focus is a trainable capacity, exactly like a muscle. It can atrophy from neglect, and it can grow stronger through deliberate, consistent use. The people you admire for their discipline and clarity of purpose were not born that way. They built it, often through painful trial and error, often after years of the same scattered frustration you might be feeling right now. Imagine your mind as a vast piece of fertile land, stretching out in every direction, capable of growing anything you choose to plant. For years, perhaps without ever realizing it, you have allowed that land to be invaded by weeds. Worry, comparison, self-doubt, distraction, resentment over things that happened years ago. These weeds did not ask permission to grow there. They simply took root because the land was left unattended, because nobody, including you, ever stood guard at the gate asking what deserved access to that fertile soil. Now imagine something different. Imagine standing at that gate with full awareness, deciding deliberately what gets planted in your mind each day, not blocking out every difficult emotion or challenging thought, because that is neither possible nor healthy, but consciously choosing the dominant focus of your attention, the recurring thoughts you feed with repetition, the images you rehearse in your imagination before they ever become reality. This is not about ignoring problems. This is about refusing to let problems, distractions, and fears occupy the most valuable real estate you will ever own, the inside of your own mind. There is a story about a master gardener who was once asked the secret to his extraordinary harvests, while neighboring farms struggled year after year with poor yields. His answer surprised everyone who expected some secret formula or rare seed variety. He said his secret was not what he planted, but how relentlessly he removed what should not be there. He spent more hours pulling weeds than he ever spent planting seeds, because he understood a truth that escapes most people. Growth is not only about adding the right things. Growth is equally about removing what competes for the same limited resources of sunlight, water, and soil. Your mind operates by the exact same law. You can spend your entire life trying to add motivation, add discipline, add positive thinking, and still find yourself stuck if you never address the weeds quietly draining your attention every single day. This book will teach you both halves of this equation: how to plant the thoughts, beliefs, and habits that build the life you actually want, and how to identify and remove the mental weeds that have been silently strangling your potential, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. Before we move forward, it is worth pausing to ask yourself a question honestly without judgment, simply as an observer of your own life. If you traced your average day, hour by hour, and mapped exactly where your attention went, what would that map reveal? How much of your mental energy went toward things that move you closer to the life you actually want? How much went toward worry about things you cannot control? How much went toward comparing yourself to people whose lives you only see in carefully curated fragments? How much went toward replaying old wounds that have already happened and cannot be changed? This is not an exercise meant to make you feel guilty. Guilt is just another distraction, another weed disguised as productivity. This is an exercise in awareness, because awareness is always the first step before change becomes possible. You cannot redirect what you refuse to see. You cannot strengthen a muscle you pretend does not exist. The simple act of honestly observing where your focus currently lives is, in itself, one of the most powerful first moves you can make toward reclaiming control of your own mind. Throughout the chapters ahead, you will be given both the deep understanding and the practical tools to begin this transformation. You will learn why your brain is wired the way it is, and why that wiring, left unmanaged, almost guarantees distraction and scattered energy. You will learn the precise mechanisms through which sustained focus translates into tangible results in your career, your finances, your relationships, and your sense of identity. You will learn how to defeat the mental noise that has been hijacking your peace of mind, how to recognize and eliminate the hidden costs of constant distraction, and how to build a mindset so resilient that external chaos no longer dictates your internal state. You will also learn one of the most underused tools available to the human mind, the practice of vivid, intentional visualization, and how the most successful people across every field, from elite athletes to world-renowned entrepreneurs, have used this exact tool to rehearse success before it ever happens in the physical world. You will explore how focus directly determines the level of success you experience, how it shapes the depth and quality of your relationships, and how it ultimately defines the very identity you carry into the world each day. And by the final chapter, you will have a complete, repeatable daily system, a structure you can return to every single morning, designed to anchor your focus before the world has a chance to scatter it. Because here is something important to understand from the very beginning. This is not a book you read once and set aside. This is a book meant to be returned to, practiced, and lived. Because focus is not a single decision you make one time. It is a daily choice, repeated until it becomes who you are. Somewhere inside you right now, there is a version of your life that you have not yet built. A version where your work reflects your true capability instead of a fraction of it. A version where your relationships feel deeply connected instead of distracted and surface level. A version where you move through your days with clarity instead of constant mental fog. That version of your life is not waiting on luck, and it is not waiting on circumstances outside your control to magically align in your favor. That version of your life is waiting on one single shift, the redirection of your focus. Where focus goes, power flows. Read that sentence again and let it settle into you, because everything else in this book is simply an expansion of that one idea. Your power, your potential, your energy, all of it follows your attention like a shadow follows a body in sunlight. You cannot separate the two. Wherever you place sustained focus, growth begins. Wherever focus disappears, decay quietly begins as well, even if you cannot see it happening in real time. This is your invitation to take back something that has likely been slipping away from you for years without your full awareness. Not your time, although time matters. Not your energy, although energy matters too. The thing slipping away has been your attention itself, the very mechanism that determines what time and energy actually accomplish. You are about to learn how to reclaim it, deliberately, permanently, and powerfully. And let this be the moment you stop drifting and start directing. Let this be the beginning of a relationship with your own mind built on intention instead of accident. The life you want has been waiting patiently this entire time, not for permission, not for luck, but for your focus to finally show up and claim it. Turn the page, in your mind, if nowhere else, and let's begin. Chapter 1. The mind is your greatest asset picture. Two people standing at the exact same starting line in life. Same neighborhood, same average income growing up, same access to schools, same number of hours in each day. 10 years later, one of them is thriving, building something meaningful, surrounded by strong relationships and a clear sense of direction. The other is stuck in the same place they started, frustrated, watching opportunities pass by, wondering why life feels like it keeps happening to them instead of for them. What separated these two people was never luck, and it was never raw talent. What separated them was how they used the one asset every human being is given in exactly equal measure at birth: their mind. You have likely spent years thinking about your assets in terms of money, property, skills, or connections. But before any of those things existed, before you earned your first dollar or learned your first skill, you possessed something infinitely more valuable, something that determined whether those other assets would ever materialize at all. Your mind is the original asset. It is the factory that produces every decision, every action, every relationship, and every outcome you will ever experience. And like any factory, its output depends entirely on how well it is managed, maintained, and directed. Most people never stop to consider this truth, because the mind is invisible in a way that money and possessions are not. You cannot hold your thoughts in your hand. You cannot see your beliefs sitting in a bank account. But make no mistake, the quality of your thinking is producing real, measurable, tangible results in your life every single day, whether you are paying attention to that production line or not. Let's talk about a man named Daniel, a composite of countless stories that follow this same pattern. Daniel grew up believing he simply was not the kind of person who succeeded in business, not because anyone explicitly told him this, but because he absorbed it from years of small comments, comparisons, and disappointments that accumulated into a quiet, settled belief. He was smart enough to recognize good opportunities when they appeared, but every single time one arrived, a quiet voice in his mind would whisper that it would not work out for him, that people like him did not get the big wins, that he should play it safe and avoid the risk of failure. For 15 years, Daniel watched colleagues with less raw talent than him rise into positions he secretly knew he was capable of holding. He told himself it was because they had better connections, or luckier timing, or simply less to lose. He never once examined the actual mechanism driving the gap between his potential and his results. That mechanism was his mind, specifically the unexamined, repetitive thoughts that ran in the background of every decision he made, thoughts so familiar to him that he no longer even recognized them as thoughts. They felt like facts. They felt like reality itself. It was not until Daniel was forced into a season of unexpected stillness, after a health scare that took him out of work for several months, that he finally had the space to observe his own mind, instead of simply living inside it without question. For the first time, he began to notice the pattern. Every opportunity that ever came his way had been quietly sabotaged, not by external circumstances, but by an internal narrative running on autopilot, a narrative he had never once consciously chosen, and had certainly never consciously challenged. This is the first truth you must absorb completely before anything else in this book will make a meaningful difference in your life. Your mind is not a passive observer of your circumstances. It is the architect of them. The thoughts you repeat most often become the lens through which you interpret every event, every opportunity, every relationship. And that lens does not simply color how you see your life. It actively shapes the decisions you make, which shapes the actions you take, which shapes the results you experience. The cycle is complete, and it is relentless, repeating itself day after day until you become aware enough to interrupt it. Here is something that might reframe how you think about your own potential entirely. You have likely spent years trying to change your results directly, working harder, pushing through exhaustion, forcing discipline through sheer willpower alone. And while effort certainly matters, this approach often fails to produce lasting change because it skips the actual source of the problem. You cannot consistently outperform the internal narrative running underneath your actions. If your mind is quietly convinced that you are not capable, not deserving, or not equipped for a particular outcome, your actions will eventually align with that belief, no matter how much surface-level effort you apply. The mind always wins the long game because it controls the decisions made in every unguarded moment when willpower runs out. This is why some people can attend every motivational seminar, read every personal development book, and still find themselves stuck in the same patterns year after year. Inspiration creates a temporary spike of energy, but it rarely touches the deeper architecture of belief that determines long-term behavior. Real transformation happens when you address the mind at its root, examining and rebuilding the actual beliefs and thought patterns that have been quietly directing your life, often since childhood, often without your conscious consent. Consider the brain itself for a moment, not in abstract terms, but in concrete biological reality. Your brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each one capable of forming thousands of connections with other neurons. Every thought you have, every skill you practice, every belief you reinforce through repetition physically strengthens certain neural pathways while allowing others to weaken from disuse. This is not metaphorical language. This is observable, measurable neuroscience. The brain is, quite literally, reshaping its own physical structure based on what you repeatedly think, focus on, and practice. This means something profound. The repeated thought patterns that have shaped your life until now are not permanent fixtures of your identity. They are neural pathways that were built through repetition, and what was built through repetition can be rebuilt through new, intentional repetition. This is the scientific foundation underneath everything this book teaches. You are not stuck with the mind you currently have. You are capable of deliberately reshaping it, the same way a sculptor reshapes raw material, through consistent, intentional effort applied over time. Think about how this principle plays out in something as simple as learning a new physical skill. When you first attempt to play a musical instrument, your fingers feel clumsy and disconnected from your intentions. The neural pathways required for that skill simply do not exist yet in a developed form. But with consistent practice, something remarkable happens. The pathways strengthen. The movements that once required intense conscious effort become automatic. What was once impossible becomes natural, not because your fingers changed, but because your brain rewired itself through repetition. Your thought patterns operate by this exact same principle, even though the process is far less visible. Every time you default to a thought of scarcity instead of abundance, of fear instead of confidence, of self-doubt instead of self-trust, you are strengthening that particular neural pathway, making it more likely to fire automatically the next time a similar situation arises. And every time you consciously interrupt that pattern and replace it with a more empowering thought, even if it feels unnatural and forced at first, you are weakening the old pathway and beginning to build a new one in its place. This is precisely why the early stages of mental transformation often feel difficult and even artificial. You are essentially fighting against years, sometimes decades, of established neural grooves, trying to carve a new path through terrain that has been shaped by repetition for most of your life. But just as a river eventually carves a new channel through solid rock with enough consistent flow, your consciously directed thoughts will eventually carve new, dominant pathways in your brain if you remain consistent long enough for the process to take hold. Let's bring this back to something practical and immediate. Right now, in this exact moment, you are holding beliefs about your own capability that you have likely never consciously examined. Beliefs about whether you are the kind of person who succeeds in relationships, in finances, in health, in creative pursuits. These beliefs feel like settled facts, the same way Daniel's belief about business success felt like an undeniable fact rather than an unexamined assumption. But beliefs are not facts. Beliefs are simply thoughts you have repeated so often that they have hardened into something that feels like truth. The empowering implication of this is enormous. If your current limiting beliefs were built through repetition, then new empowering beliefs can be built the exact same way. This is not about denying reality or pretending circumstances are different than they actually are. This is about recognizing that your interpretation of circumstances and your beliefs about your own capacity to navigate them are far more flexible and far more within your control than you have ever been taught to believe. Here's an exercise to begin putting this principle into immediate practice. Take a few quiet minutes, away from any screen or distraction, and write down 3 beliefs you currently hold about your own potential in an area of life that matters deeply to you. It might be your career, your relationships, your health, your creative ambitions, or your financial future. Write these beliefs exactly as they appear in your mind, without editing them to sound more positive than they actually feel. Once you have written these 3 beliefs, examine each one with a simple but powerful question. Is this belief actually true? Or is this simply a thought I have repeated so many times that it now feels true? Notice the difference between these 2 categories. A belief like gravity pulls objects toward the earth is verifiably true, regardless of how many times you think it. But a belief like I am not the kind of person who succeeds in leadership roles is not a fact about the universe. It is a conclusion drawn from a limited set of past experiences, repeated until it calcified into something that feels permanent. For each limiting belief you identified, write an alternative belief, one that is equally plausible given the actual evidence of your life, but far more empowering and aligned with the future you actually want to build. This is not about lying to yourself or engaging in baseless positive thinking disconnected from reality. This is about recognizing that most limiting beliefs are not the only possible conclusion available from your life experience. They are simply the conclusion you happen to land on, often during a vulnerable or painful moment, and have repeated ever since without question. Daniel, the man we discussed earlier, eventually went through this exact process during his months of forced stillness. He identified the belief that people like him did not get the big opportunities, and he traced it back to a specific period in his early 20s when 2 significant opportunities fell through in quick succession, for reasons that had far more to do with timing and circumstance than with any deficiency in his own character or capability. He had taken those 2 specific, time-bound experiences and generalized them into a permanent, identity-level belief about who he fundamentally was. Once he saw this pattern clearly, he could not unsee it. He began the deliberate work of replacing that old belief with a new one, repeating it daily, writing it down, looking for evidence in his own history that supported this new, more accurate interpretation of his capability. It did not happen overnight. The old neural pathway had years of reinforcement behind it, and the new pathway needed time and repetition to strengthen. But within a year, colleagues who had known Daniel for over a decade began commenting on a noticeable shift in how he carried himself, how he spoke about his own future, and how he approached opportunities that would have once triggered instant self-sabotage. This is the practical power of understanding your mind as your greatest asset. It is not a fixed inheritance you are stuck with for life. It is a living, adaptable system, constantly being shaped by the thoughts you choose to repeat and the focus you choose to maintain. Every single day, you are either investing in this asset or allowing it to depreciate through neglect. exactly the way a piece of property gains or loses value, depending on whether it receives consistent care and attention. There is a memorable principle worth carrying with you from this chapter, one you might choose to write somewhere visible as a daily reminder. Your mind is not simply where your life is experienced. Your mind is where your life is actually built, thought by thought, belief by belief, long before any external result ever becomes visible to the people around you. Treat it with the same seriousness and intentional investment you would apply to any other asset you considered essential to your future. As we move into the next chapter, we will go even deeper into this principle, exploring exactly how your thoughts translate into the physical reality you experience, examining the precise mechanism through which an internal world of beliefs and focus becomes an external world of relationships, achievements, and circumstances. You are about to understand something that, once seen clearly, can never again be unseen. Your thoughts are not simply commentary on your life. They are the blueprint from which your life is being continuously constructed. Chapter 2. Your thoughts shape your reality. Close your eyes for a moment, even if only in your imagination, and picture two architects standing in front of identical empty lots of land. Both have access to the same materials, the same tools, and the same amount of time. One architect carries in his mind a clear, detailed vision of a beautiful, functional building, refined through years of careful thought and study. The other architect carries no clear vision at all, simply reacting moment to moment, placing materials wherever convenience or impulse dictates. At the end of the process, one lot contains a structure that stands strong, serves its purpose, and reflects genuine intention. The other contains something disorganized, unstable, and disconnected from any real purpose. Your life is being built using this exact same process every single day, whether you recognize it or not. Your thoughts are the blueprint, your actions are the construction, and your circumstances, the relationships you build, the career you create, the sense of fulfillment or frustration you carry, are the finished structure standing as physical evidence of the thoughts that came before it. This is not a mystical or abstract claim. It is observable in the most ordinary moments of daily life. Consider how differently two people respond to the exact same event: a canceled meeting, an unexpected expense, a difficult conversation with a loved one. One person interprets the canceled meeting as evidence that nobody respects their time, spirals into frustration, and carries that frustration into every subsequent interaction that day, poisoning relationships that had nothing to do with the original event. The other person interprets the same canceled meeting as an unexpected gift of time, uses it productively, and moves through the rest of their day with a sense of ease that positively colors every interaction that follows. The external event was identical in both cases. What differed entirely was the thought that immediately followed the event, the interpretation layered on top of raw circumstance. And it was that thought, not the circumstance itself, that determined everything that happened next: the emotional state, the subsequent decisions, the quality of every interaction for the remainder of the day. This is the mechanism through which thoughts shape reality, not through some mysterious cosmic force, but through the very concrete chain reaction of thought leading to emotion, emotion leading to action, and action leading to outcome. Let's walk through this chain reaction slowly, because understanding each link is essential to gaining genuine control over the process. It begins with a thought, often automatic and unexamined, a quick interpretation of whatever circumstance you are facing. That thought immediately generates an emotional response. Thoughts of threat or inadequacy generate anxiety or shame. Thoughts of opportunity or capability generate confidence or excitement. This emotional response then drives behavior, often without conscious deliberation, because emotions are powerful motivators that frequently bypass careful rational analysis. And finally, that behavior produces a real, tangible outcome in the world, an outcome that often reinforces whatever thought initiated the entire chain in the first place. This is why limiting beliefs become so deeply entrenched and so difficult to escape without deliberate intervention. They create self-reinforcing loops. If you believe you are not capable of public speaking, That thought generates anxiety. That anxiety leads to avoidance or poor performance when you cannot avoid the situation entirely. And that poor performance becomes evidence that reinforces the original belief, making it feel even more certain and unquestionable the next time the situation arises. The loop tightens with each repetition, until the belief feels like an immutable fact about your fundamental nature, rather than a pattern you have unintentionally trained through repeated thought and reaction. The encouraging flip side of this same mechanism is equally true, and this is where your power to change everything truly lies. If you can interrupt this loop at the level of thought, before it cascades into emotion, action, and outcome, you can begin building an entirely different reality, one repetition at a time. This is not about denying difficult circumstances or pretending challenges do not exist. This is about recognizing that your interpretation of those circumstances, the thought you choose to dwell on, is the single most powerful lever available to you in determining what happens next. Let's talk about a woman named Sarah, whose story illustrates this principle with striking clarity. Sarah spent years believing that she was simply unlucky in relationships, that she consistently attracted partners who were emotionally unavailable or unreliable. Every new relationship seemed to confirm this belief, reinforcing a narrative that felt increasingly hopeless with each disappointing pattern. From the outside, it appeared as though Sarah was simply experiencing bad luck, an unfair string of poor circumstances beyond her control. But when Sarah finally began examining her own thought patterns with honest curiosity, she discovered something she had never consciously noticed before. From the very earliest stage of meeting someone new, her mind would immediately begin scanning for signs of unavailability or unreliability, evidence that would confirm her existing belief. This scanning was not conscious or deliberate. It happened automatically, the way your eyes are naturally drawn toward movement in your peripheral vision. But this automatic scanning shaped everything that followed. Because Sarah was unconsciously looking for signs of emotional unavailability, she would interpret ambiguous behavior, a delayed text response, a busy week, a moment of quietness, as confirmation of her fear, often before there was any actual evidence to support that interpretation. This interpretation generated anxiety, and that anxiety led Sarah to behave in ways that ironically increased the likelihood of the very outcome she feared, becoming clingy or distant at exactly the moments that would have benefited from calm security, testing partners in subtle ways that created the friction she was desperately trying to avoid. Sarah's thoughts were not simply observing her relationship reality. They were actively participating in creating it. This is an uncomfortable truth for many people to accept, because it can initially feel like an accusation, as though difficult circumstances are somehow entirely your own fault. This is not the intention of this principle, and it is important to be precise about what is actually being claimed here. External circumstances, including the actions of other people, are real and often outside your direct control. But your interpretation of those circumstances, the thoughts you choose to dwell on, and the actions those thoughts subsequently drive, are squarely within your sphere of influence, and they have a far greater impact on your ongoing reality than most people ever recognize. Once Sarah became aware of this pattern, she began deliberately practicing a different approach. Rather than unconsciously scanning for signs of unavailability, she practiced consciously noticing evidence of genuine connection and consistency when it actually appeared, training her attention to seek a different kind of evidence than it had been trained to find for years. This was not about ignoring real red flags when they appeared. It was about no longer manufacturing red flags out of ambiguous, neutral behavior, simply because her mind had been trained to expect disappointment. The shift did not happen instantly, because no genuine neural rewiring happens instantly. But over the course of several months, Sarah noticed something remarkable. Her relationships began to feel fundamentally different, not because the dating pool had suddenly changed, but because her own thoughts, emotions, and behaviors had changed, which altered the entire dynamic of how she showed up and how others responded to her presence. This story illustrates a principle that extends far beyond romantic relationships into every domain of life. Your dominant thoughts function like a filtering system, determining what you notice, how you interpret what you notice, and ultimately what you create through your subsequent actions. Two people can walk through the exact same environment, surrounded by the exact same opportunities and challenges, and walk away with entirely different experiences, simply because their internal filtering systems were tuned to notice and emphasize different things. This brings us to one of the most important and frequently misunderstood aspects of how thoughts shape reality: the role of repetition. A single thought, experienced once, rarely has significant power to shape your life. The danger and the opportunity both lie in repetition. The thoughts you think occasionally have minimal impact. The thoughts you think habitually, the ones that run through your mind dozens or even hundreds of times throughout an ordinary day, are the ones doing the heavy lifting and constructing your actual experience of reality. This is why simply having a single positive thought during a moment of inspiration rarely creates lasting change. If that single positive thought is immediately drowned out by hundreds of habitual, unexamined thoughts running in the background for the rest of the day, the positive thought has almost no chance to influence your behavior in any meaningful way. Genuine transformation requires shifting the dominant, repeated pattern, not simply inserting occasional positive thoughts into an otherwise unchanged mental landscape. Here is a practical exercise to help you begin identifying your own dominant thought patterns, the repeated mental habits that are quietly shaping your reality far more than any occasional inspired thought ever could. Throughout the next several days, carry a small notebook or use the notes function on your phone, and whenever you notice a strong emotional reaction, whether positive or negative, pause and write down the thought that immediately preceded that emotion. Do not judge the thought as good or bad. Simply record it with honest accuracy. After several days of this practice, review what you have written and look for patterns. Are there recurring themes, recurring interpretations, recurring assumptions that show up across multiple, seemingly unrelated situations? Most people are astonished to discover how few distinct thought patterns are actually driving the vast majority of their emotional reactions throughout an ordinary week. A handful of deeply repeated beliefs, often related to worthiness, capability, safety, or belonging, tend to underlie an enormous range of seemingly different daily reactions. Once you have identified these dominant patterns, you have already accomplished something most people never achieve in their entire lives. You have made the invisible visible. You can now see the actual blueprint that has been constructing your reality, rather than simply experiencing the finished structure without ever understanding how it was built. This awareness alone, even before any deliberate effort to change the patterns, begins to loosen their grip, because thoughts operate with far less power once they are seen clearly, rather than simply absorbed unconsciously. There is a saying worth carrying forward from this chapter, simple enough to remember during a busy day, but profound enough to change how you move through every situation you encounter. You do not see the world as it is. You see the world as you are. Your thoughts are not a neutral window onto objective reality. They are an active lens, shaped by years of repetition, determining what you notice, how you interpret it, and what you ultimately create in response. This principle carries enormous responsibility, but it also carries enormous freedom, and it is essential to hold both of these truths together, rather than letting one overshadow the other. The responsibility is this: you can no longer fully blame your circumstances for the entirety of your experience, because your interpretation of those circumstances is doing significant work in shaping the outcome. The freedom is this: because your thoughts are within your capacity to examine, question, and deliberately reshape, you are never permanently trapped by any single pattern, no matter how long it has been running or how true it currently feels. As we move forward into the next chapter, we will explore a concept that builds directly on everything you have just learned. A concept that will give you a precise, practical formula for directing your focus with far greater intention than you have likely ever applied before. You now understand that thoughts shape reality. The next step is learning exactly how to choose, sustain, and direct those thoughts on purpose, rather than leaving them to chance, habit, or the relentless pull of external distraction. Chapter 3. The Focus Formula. There is a simple but startling experiment that has been conducted in various forms across psychology research for decades, and the results never fail to capture attention because of how clearly they reveal something most people never consciously notice about their own minds. Researchers ask participants to watch a short video of people passing a basketball back and forth, with instructions to count the number of passes made by players wearing white shirts. Partway through the video, someone in a gorilla costume walks directly through the middle of the scene, pauses, and walks off screen. When asked afterward whether they noticed anything unusual, a significant percentage of participants, often close to half, report seeing nothing out of the ordinary at all. They missed an entire gorilla walking directly through their field of vision, not because their eyes failed to register the image, but because their focus was so narrowly directed toward counting passes that their conscious mind simply did not process information outside that specific frame of attention. This experiment reveals something profound about how human perception actually works, something that has enormous implications for how you direct your life. You do not perceive everything available in your environment at any given moment. You perceive what you are focused on, and you filter out, almost entirely, everything that falls outside that focus, regardless of how significant that filtered-out information might actually be. Your brain is not capable of processing the full complexity of every moment, so it relies heavily on focus to determine what deserves conscious attention and what gets discarded before it ever reaches your awareness. This is not a flaw in human design. It is a necessary feature, given the staggering amount of sensory information available at any given moment. If your brain attempted to consciously process every sound, every visual detail, every sensation occurring around you simultaneously, you would be completely overwhelmed within seconds, unable to function at even a basic level. Focus exists precisely because it allows your brain to filter an impossibly large amount of information down to a manageable, actionable subset. But here is where this becomes critically important to your daily life, because focus determines what you perceive, and what you perceive shapes what you believe is possible, and what you believe is possible shapes the actions you take. The direction of your focus is silently determining the boundaries of your entire experienced reality. Two people can stand in the exact same room, surrounded by the exact same opportunities, and one will notice possibilities the other completely misses, not because one person has better opportunities available to them, but because their focus is trained to notice different things. This brings us to the central tool of this chapter, something we will call the focus formula. It is not a complicated concept, but like most simple truths, its power lies in consistent application rather than intellectual understanding alone. The focus formula states that consistent attention, directed toward a clearly defined target, combined with emotional investment, produces accelerated movement toward that target. Three components working together: attention, clarity of target, emotional investment. Remove any one of these three components, and the formula breaks down, often producing the frustrating experience of working hard without seeing proportional results. Let's examine each component individually, because understanding precisely how each piece functions will allow you to diagnose exactly where your own focus might currently be breaking down. The first component, attention, refers simply to where your mental energy is being directed moment to moment throughout your day. This is the most basic and most frequently neglected component, because most people give almost no conscious thought to managing where their attention goes. They simply react to whatever captures their interest in any given moment, allowing external stimuli, notifications, conversations, worries, to direct their attention rather than directing it themselves. The second component, clarity of target, refers to how specifically and concretely you have defined what you are actually trying to focus on. Vague targets produce vague results. If you say you want to be successful, your mind has no precise direction to organize itself around, because success could mean 1,000 different things, and your attention will scatter across all of them without ever building meaningful momentum in any single direction. But if you define your target with precision, for example, deciding to focus specifically on developing a particular skill that will advance a specific career goal within a specific time frame, your mind suddenly has something concrete to organize its attention around, and that clarity dramatically increases the efficiency of every hour you invest. The third component, emotional investment, refers to the depth of meaning and feeling you attach to your target. This component is frequently underestimated, yet it might be the most powerful of the three. Pure intellectual understanding of a goal rarely sustains long-term focus through difficulty, because intellectual understanding alone does not generate the motivational energy required to persist when obstacles inevitably appear. But when a goal is emotionally significant, connected to something you deeply care about, your relationships, your sense of purpose, your desire to provide for people you love, your focus naturally intensifies and becomes far more resistant to the pull of competing distractions. Let's bring these three components together through a story that illustrates the focus formula in action. Consider a man named Marcus, who spent several years attempting to build a side business while working a demanding full-time job. For the first 2 years, Marcus made minimal progress, despite working on his business most evenings after work. When he honestly examined why his effort was not translating into meaningful results, he discovered that all three components of the focus formula were weak. His attention was scattered across dozens of different business ideas, never staying with any single concept long enough to develop real momentum. His target was vague, defined only as wanting to make extra money, without any specific, concrete definition of what success would actually look like or by what date he hoped to achieve it. And his emotional investment, while present, was disconnected from anything deeply meaningful. He wanted extra income in a general sense, but he had never connected that goal to anything that truly moved him at an emotional level. Everything changed for Marcus during a single conversation with his daughter, who mentioned almost in passing that she hoped to attend a particular university that Marcus knew the family could not currently afford without significant financial strain. In that moment, something shifted in Marcus that no amount of abstract motivation about extra income had ever produced. His target became specific and concrete, building enough additional income within 4 years to fund his daughter's education without debt. His emotional investment deepened immediately and powerfully, connected now to his daughter's future and his desire to provide for her without limitation. With this newly clarified target and newly intensified emotional investment, Marcus naturally found it far easier to direct sustained attention toward a single, specific business concept rather than scattering his energy across multiple vague possibilities. The same number of hours he had been investing for 2 years with minimal results suddenly began producing visible momentum within months. Not because Marcus suddenly became more talented or more disciplined in some abstract sense, but because all three components of the focus formula finally aligned and reinforced each other. This story reveals something essential about how focus actually operates in real human lives. It is rarely a simple matter of trying harder through sheer willpower. Willpower is a finite resource that depletes throughout the day, and relying on willpower alone to maintain focus is an exhausting, unsustainable strategy. Genuine, sustained focus emerges far more naturally when attention is organized around a clearly defined target that carries real emotional significance. When these elements align, focus stops feeling like a constant uphill battle and starts feeling like a natural, almost magnetic pull toward your goal. This understanding gives you a powerful diagnostic tool for any area of your life where you feel stuck despite genuine effort. Rather than assuming you simply lack discipline or motivation, ask yourself 3 specific questions. Is my attention actually being directed consistently toward this goal, or is it scattered across competing priorities throughout my day? Have I defined this target with enough specificity that my mind knows precisely what to organize itself around? And have I connected this goal to something that genuinely matters to me at a deep emotional level? Or am I pursuing it for reasons that remain abstract and disconnected from real feeling? Often, you will discover that the missing piece is not effort at all, but one of these 3 specific components. Perhaps your attention is consistent, your target is clear, but you have never allowed yourself to feel the genuine emotional significance of what you are working toward, treating the goal as a purely practical matter rather than something connected to your deeper values and desires. Or perhaps your emotional investment is intense, but your target remains too vague for that emotional energy to translate into specific, organized action. Here is an exercise designed to help you apply the focus formula immediately to a goal currently important in your life. Choose one significant goal you have been working toward, whether in your career, your health, your relationships, or any other meaningful domain. Write this goal down, and then immediately rewrite it with far greater specificity than your original version, including concrete numbers, dates, or measurable outcomes wherever possible. A vague goal like getting healthier becomes something far more powerful when rewritten as completing 3 strength training sessions weekly for the next 90 days, building toward a specific, measurable fitness milestone. Next, spend several minutes honestly connecting this goal to something emotionally significant in your life. Why does this goal actually matter to you, beyond the surface-level practical benefit? How will achieving this goal affect the people you love, your sense of identity, your ability to show up fully in the roles that matter most to you? Write this emotional connection down explicitly, because the simple act of articulating it strengthens its presence in your conscious awareness, making it far more likely to influence your daily behavior. Finally, examine your current daily and weekly schedule honestly. Where is your attention actually being directed throughout an average week? Identify specific blocks of time you can dedicate to this newly clarified, emotionally significant goal, and treat those blocks with the same seriousness you would treat an important meeting that could not be moved or canceled. This is the practical bridge between understanding the focus formula intellectually and actually experiencing its power in your daily life. There is a phrase worth holding on to as you move forward from this chapter, one that captures the essence of everything we have explored. Focus without clarity is wasted energy, and clarity without emotional investment is fragile motivation. But when attention, clarity, and emotional investment combine, an almost unstoppable momentum begins to build. This is the focus formula, and it is available to you in any domain of life you choose to apply it. As we move into the next chapter, we will turn our attention to one of the greatest obstacles standing between you and the consistent application of this formula: the relentless mental noise that fills most people's minds throughout an ordinary day, drowning out clarity, fragmenting attention, and exhausting emotional energy before it can ever be directed toward anything meaningful. You now understand the formula for powerful focus. The next step is learning how to defeat the noise that has been preventing you from applying it consistently. Chapter 4. Defeating mental noise. Imagine trying to have a meaningful conversation with someone you love in the middle of a crowded, chaotic marketplace, surrounded by vendors shouting their prices, music blaring from multiple directions, and a constant stream of strangers pushing past you on every side. Even if the conversation matters deeply to both of you, even if you are both genuinely trying to listen, the sheer volume of competing noise makes real connection almost impossible. You catch fragments of what the other person says. You miss entire sentences. You walk away feeling unsatisfied, knowing something important was communicated, but unable to fully grasp what it actually was. This is precisely what happens inside your own mind every single day, except the marketplace never closes and the noise never fully stops, unless you deliberately learn how to quiet it. Mental noise refers to the constant stream of unfiltered thoughts, worries, replayed conversations, anticipatory anxieties, and random associations that fill the average mind during nearly every waking moment. For most people, this noise is so constant and so familiar that they no longer recognize it as noise at all. It simply feels like thinking, the normal background hum of being a conscious human being. But here is something crucial to understand. Not all thinking is equal. There is a profound difference between deliberate, focused thought directed toward something meaningful and the chaotic, repetitive mental noise that fills most unguarded moments. One produces clarity, progress, and peace. The other produces exhaustion, fragmentation, and a persistent low-grade anxiety that many people have simply accepted as a normal part of modern life, without ever questioning whether it has to be this way. Consider how much of your average day is spent engaged in this second category of thinking, replaying a slightly awkward interaction from earlier in the day, wondering if you said the wrong thing. worrying about a future event that has not yet happened and may never happen in the way you are imagining, running through hypothetical arguments with someone who frustrated you, rehearsing things you wish you had said, comparing your circumstances to someone else's curated social media presence, even though you know intellectually that comparison is rarely accurate or fair, cycling through to-do lists without ever actually committing to act on any single item. None of this mental activity is inherently sinister or unusual. Every human mind engages in some version of this noise. The problem is not that this noise exists. The problem is that, left unmanaged, it consumes an enormous percentage of your daily mental bandwidth, leaving far less available for the deliberate, focused thinking required to actually move your life forward in the direction you want it to go. Every minute spent lost in unproductive mental noise is a minute unavailable for the kind of focused attention that builds careers, deepens relationships, and creates meaningful progress toward your goals. Researchers studying attention and cognitive load have found that the average human mind wanders from the present task at hand a remarkable percentage of waking hours, often estimated at close to half of all conscious time. This means that for roughly half of your waking life, your mind is not actually engaged with whatever you are doing or whoever you are with. It is somewhere else entirely, lost in mental noise about the past, the future, or hypothetical scenarios that may never occur. Think about the staggering implications of this finding. Half of your life, measured in actual conscious experience, is being spent somewhere other than the present moment you are actually living in. This matters enormously for the principle at the heart of this entire book. If where focus goes, power flows, then mental noise represents power leaking away in massive quantities every single day, dispersed across worries, replays, and hypotheticals that produce no actual benefit, no actual progress, and often no actual resolution. The energy spent on this noise simply evaporates, leaving you depleted without anything productive to show for the depletion. Let's talk about a woman named Patricia, whose experience illustrates this principle vividly. Patricia worked in a demanding profession that required sharp analytical thinking and creative problem-solving. She often described feeling perpetually tired, despite getting adequate sleep, despite not working unusually long hours compared to her colleagues. She assumed this exhaustion was simply a byproduct of her demanding career, an unavoidable cost of doing meaningful work in a competitive field. It was not until Patricia began deliberately observing her own mental patterns, prompted by a period of unusual stillness during a family emergency, that pulled her away from her normal routine, that she discovered something she had never previously recognized. Throughout an ordinary workday, her mind was almost constantly engaged in noise that had nothing to do with her actual tasks. Worry about whether a colleague's slightly curt email meant she had done something wrong. Replaying a disagreement with her sister from several weeks earlier. Anxious anticipation about an upcoming performance review that was still months away. Comparison with a former classmate whose career, observed only through social media, appeared more impressive than her own. When Patricia honestly tracked this mental activity for several days, she was shocked to discover how little of her actual conscious mental energy throughout the workday was directed toward the work itself. The exhaustion she had attributed simply to the demands of her career was, in significant part, actually the exhaustion of running an enormous amount of unproductive mental noise simultaneously alongside her actual responsibilities, like running multiple draining background programs on a computer while also trying to use that same computer for important work. This realization gave Patricia something she had never had before: a clear, specific target for improvement. Rather than vaguely trying to manage stress or work harder, she now had a precise understanding of where her energy was actually being depleted, and that precision allowed her to begin addressing the problem directly, rather than continuing to misdiagnose it as simply the unavoidable cost of a demanding career. This brings us to the practical heart of this chapter, the actual tools and techniques for quieting mental noise and reclaiming the focus it has been silently stealing from you. The first and perhaps most foundational tool is something deceptively simple, yet remarkably powerful when practiced consistently. It is called the thought audit, and it builds directly on the awareness practice introduced in earlier chapters, but applies it specifically to identifying and categorizing mental noise. To practice the thought audit, set aside a few minutes at the end of each day, ideally before the busyness of evening activities fully takes over. Simply ask yourself, as honestly as possible, what occupied my mind today that did not actually serve any productive purpose? Write down whatever comes to mind without judgment, simply naming the categories of noise you notice. Perhaps it was worry about a conversation that has not yet happened. Perhaps it was rumination about something that already happened and cannot be changed. Perhaps it was comparison with someone else's life circumstances. The power of this exercise lies not in eliminating these thoughts through sheer force, which rarely works and often backfires by giving the thoughts even more attention through the act of suppression. The power lies in building awareness, because awareness is the prerequisite for any deliberate change. Once you can clearly name the specific patterns of noise that recur in your own mind, you gain the ability to recognize them in real time, in the actual moment they begin to arise, rather than only recognizing them retrospectively at the end of the day. This leads to the second tool, something we will call the interruption technique. Once you have built enough awareness to recognize mental noise as it begins to arise, rather than only after it has already consumed significant mental energy, you can practice a specific, simple interruption. The moment you notice your mind sliding into unproductive noise, whether worry, rumination, or comparison, gently say to yourself, internally, "Not now," and consciously redirect your attention to whatever you are actually trying to focus on in that moment. This technique works best when it is practiced without harsh self-judgment. The goal is not to berate yourself for having noisy thoughts, which simply adds another layer of unproductive mental activity on top of the original noise. The goal is simply to notice, gently redirect, and continue moving forward. Over time, with consistent practice, this redirection becomes faster and more automatic, the same way any skill becomes more natural through repetition. There is an important distinction to draw here, because this technique is sometimes misunderstood as a call to suppress or ignore every difficult thought or emotion, which would be both impossible and unhealthy. Some thoughts deserve genuine attention and processing, particularly emotions related to real grief, real conflict that needs resolution, or real decisions that require careful deliberation. The interruption technique is specifically aimed at the repetitive, circular, unproductive noise that does not lead toward resolution or growth, the worry that simply loops without producing any actual decision or action, the rumination that replays the past without producing any actual learning or closure. A helpful way to distinguish productive thought from unproductive noise is to ask a simple question. Is this thought leading me toward a decision, an action, or genuine emotional processing, or is it simply looping without producing any forward movement? Genuine problem solving, even when it involves difficult emotions, tends to move toward resolution. Mental noise tends to circle endlessly without ever arriving anywhere, because its function was never actually to solve anything. It was simply an unmanaged habit of attention, repeating familiar grooves without any genuine purpose. The third tool for defeating mental noise involves something often underestimated in its power: the practice of externalizing thoughts through writing. There is something almost mysterious about the effect of taking a swirling, chaotic thought from inside your mind and committing it to paper. The thought that felt overwhelming and all-consuming while trapped inside your head often appears smaller, more manageable, and sometimes even somewhat absurd once it exists as actual words on an actual page in front of you. This practice, sometimes called a brain dump, involves setting aside a few minutes, particularly during moments when mental noise feels especially loud, to simply write down every thought currently competing for your attention, without any concern for organization, grammar, or coherence. The goal is not to produce a polished piece of writing. The goal is to physically remove these thoughts from the limited working memory of your mind and place them somewhere external, freeing up mental space that was previously occupied by the effort of simply holding on to and circulating these thoughts internally. Many people who practice this technique consistently report a noticeable, almost immediate sense of relief, a feeling of mental spaciousness that simply was not available while the thoughts remained unexpressed and circulating internally. This is not a coincidence or a placebo effect. Your working memory, the mental space available for active thought, is genuinely limited, and unexpressed thoughts compete for that limited space, draining capacity that could otherwise be directed toward focused, productive thinking. The fourth and final tool we will explore in this chapter addresses a specific, particularly powerful source of mental noise: the habit of mentally rehearsing future conversations or scenarios that have not yet occurred and may never occur in the way you are imagining them. This particular form of noise deserves special attention because it often masquerades as productive preparation, when in reality, it frequently produces nothing more than wasted emotional energy and increased anxiety. There is, of course, a healthy version of mental preparation, briefly considering how you might approach an important upcoming conversation, organizing your key points, anticipating likely questions. This healthy preparation tends to be brief, purposeful, and produces a sense of readiness rather than escalating anxiety. The unhealthy version, by contrast, involves repeatedly replaying imagined scenarios, often escalating them into worst-case outcomes, rehearsing the same imagined conversation dozens of times without ever arriving at genuine clarity or calm. If you notice yourself caught in this particular pattern, a useful technique is to set a deliberate, conscious time limit for preparation. Give yourself a specific brief window, perhaps 10 minutes, to think through an upcoming difficult conversation, identify your key points, and then deliberately close that mental file, redirecting your attention elsewhere with the explicit acknowledgement that you have already done the useful preparation available to you, and further rehearsal will only produce diminishing returns of comfort while consuming increasing amounts of valuable mental energy. Let's return to Patricia for a moment, because her continued story illustrates how these tools, applied consistently over time, can produce meaningful transformation. After identifying the specific patterns of noise consuming her mental energy, Patricia began practicing the thought audit each evening, building increasing awareness of her own patterns. She then began applying the interruption technique during her workday, gently redirecting her attention each time she noticed herself sliding into worry about her colleague's email tone or comparison with her former classmate's career. Within several weeks, Patricia reported something that initially surprised her. Her workday felt noticeably less exhausting despite her actual workload remaining unchanged. She was completing the same tasks, attending the same meetings, facing the same deadlines. Yet she found herself with noticeably more mental energy remaining at the end of each day. This was not because her circumstances had changed in any way. It was because she had stopped running so many unproductive background programs simultaneously, freeing up capacity that had previously been consumed by mental noise she had never consciously recognized. This is the practical promise of learning to defeat mental noise. It does not require changing your external circumstances, your job, your relationships, or your daily responsibilities. It requires changing the internal management of your own attention, recognizing and gently interrupting the patterns that have been silently draining your energy, often for years, without your full awareness. This single shift, practiced consistently, has the power to make every other goal in your life significantly more achievable, simply by freeing up the mental bandwidth that was previously being consumed by noise, rather than directed toward genuine focus. There is a memorable phrase worth carrying forward from this chapter. Silence is not the absence of sound around you. Silence is the presence of intentional focus within you. You may never be able to control every external noise in your environment, but you can absolutely learn to quiet the internal noise that has been competing for your most valuable resource, your own attention. As we move into the next chapter, we will examine something closely related to mental noise but distinct enough to deserve its own dedicated exploration: the broader phenomenon of distraction and the hidden costs it imposes on your life. Costs that extend far beyond simple lost time into territory that affects your relationships, your career trajectory, and even your fundamental sense of identity and self-respect. Chapter 5. The Hidden Cost of Distraction. There is a particular kind of grief that rarely gets named directly, a quiet mourning for hours, days, and years that seem to have simply vanished. consumed by something you cannot quite identify or account for. You sit down at the end of a long day, look back across the previous 12 or 14 hours, and feel a strange unease, a sense that significant time has passed without producing anything you can clearly point to as meaningful progress. You were busy, certainly. You were occupied, undoubtedly. But busy and occupied are not the same as productive, and occupied is not the same as fulfilled. This is the hidden cost of distraction, and it operates on a scale that most people drastically underestimate, because its damage rarely announces itself in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it accumulates silently, minute by minute, day by day, until years have passed, and you find yourself wondering how so much time disappeared while producing so little of what you actually wanted to build in your life. Let's start by examining distraction in its most literal, immediate sense, before exploring its deeper and more insidious effects. Consider how often, during any given hour of focused work, your attention is interrupted by something external: a notification on your phone, a message from a colleague, an email arriving in your inbox. Each individual interruption might seem trivial, lasting only a few seconds to glance at and dismiss. But research into attention and cognitive switching reveals something most people never consider. The actual cost of an interruption extends far beyond the few seconds spent directly engaging with it. When your focused attention is interrupted, your mind does not simply pause and then instantly resume exactly where it left off. Instead, there is a measurable period, often extending several minutes, during which your brain works to rebuild the depth of focus you had achieved before the interruption occurred. This phenomenon, sometimes called attention residue, means that even brief interruptions impose a cost far larger than their apparent duration, because they fracture the deep cognitive engagement that took time and energy to build in the first place. Consider what this means across an ordinary workday filled with dozens of small interruptions. If each interruption costs not just the few seconds of direct engagement, but also several additional minutes of diminished focus while your brain works to rebuild concentration, the cumulative cost across a full day becomes staggering. Many studies examining knowledge workers have found that the average person experiences a significant interruption every few minutes throughout their workday, and that achieving genuinely deep, focused work for extended, uninterrupted periods has become increasingly rare in modern professional environments. This explains a frustration that many people experience without fully understanding its source. The feeling of working an entire day, remaining busy from morning until evening, yet accomplishing remarkably little of actual significance. The problem is rarely a lack of effort or a lack of hours invested. The problem is that those hours have been fractured into so many small, interrupted fragments that genuine deep focus, the kind required to produce meaningful, creative, or analytical work, never had the opportunity to develop and sustain itself. But the cost of distraction extends well beyond simple productivity loss, into territory that touches something far more personal and significant: the quality of your relationships and your presence with the people you love. Consider how often you have been physically present with someone important to you: a partner, a child, a close friend, while your attention remained elsewhere entirely, drawn toward a phone, a worry about work, or some other distraction that pulled you away from genuine presence in that shared moment. There is a particular kind of loneliness that exists, even within close relationships, when this pattern becomes habitual, a loneliness experienced by the person who is technically present but mentally absent, scrolling through a phone during a meal together, half listening to a child's story while mentally composing a work email, nodding along in a conversation while actually rehearsing what to say next rather than genuinely absorbing what the other person is sharing. This fractured presence accumulates over time into a relationship quality that feels subtly diminished, even when neither person can point to any single dramatic incident that explains the growing distance. Think about a father who attends every single one of his daughter's soccer games, never missing one across her entire childhood, yet who spends a significant portion of each game checking his phone, responding to work messages, mentally elsewhere even while physically present on the sidelines. Years later, when his daughter reflects on her childhood, what she remembers is not the perfect attendance record. What she remembers is the feeling, The sense, often impossible to articulate precisely, that her father was often somewhere else, even when he was right there beside her. This is perhaps the most painful and most underappreciated cost of chronic distraction, the way it silently erodes the depth of connection in relationships that matter most, not through any single dramatic failure, but through the slow, cumulative effect of fractured attention repeated across thousands of small moments. Presence, genuine, undivided presence, is one of the most powerful gifts you can offer another human being, and distraction is the primary thief that steals this gift away, often without either person fully realizing what has been lost until significant time has passed. There is yet another cost of distraction worth examining carefully, one that affects your relationship with yourself rather than your relationship with others. This is the erosion of your capacity for deep, sustained thinking, the kind of thinking required to genuinely understand complex problems, to develop original ideas, to engage in the slow, patient reflection that produces wisdom rather than simply reaction. In an environment of constant distraction, this capacity, like any unused muscle, begins to atrophy. Consider how often, in the modern environment, you find yourself reaching for distraction the moment any task requires sustained mental effort or produces even mild discomfort. A difficult problem at work prompts a quick check of your phone rather than continued engagement with the challenge. A moment of boredom while waiting in line prompts immediate reaching for entertainment, rather than allowing your mind to simply rest or wander productively. A challenging emotion that arises prompts immediate distraction, rather than the patient sitting with discomfort that often produces genuine emotional processing and growth. This pattern, repeated thousands of times across months and years, gradually weakens your capacity to tolerate the discomfort that almost always accompanies genuine deep thinking, difficult problem solving, and emotional growth. You become, in a very real sense, less capable of sustained focus over time, not because your fundamental cognitive ability has changed, but because the muscle of sustained attention has been allowed to weaken through chronic avoidance whenever discomfort arises. This presents one of the more uncomfortable truths of this chapter, but an essential one to confront honestly. Much of modern distraction functions as a form of avoidance, a way of escaping discomfort, boredom, or difficulty rather than facing it directly. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because recognizing this pattern in your own life is often deeply illuminating. The next time you notice yourself reaching automatically for your phone or some other distraction, pause and ask yourself honestly, what am I currently trying to avoid feeling or facing in this moment? Often, the honest answer reveals something significant. Perhaps you are avoiding the discomfort of a difficult task that requires more mental effort than you currently feel motivated to invest. Perhaps you are avoiding an uncomfortable emotion that arose unexpectedly: boredom, loneliness, anxiety, or sadness. Perhaps you are avoiding the vulnerability of being fully present in a conversation that touches on something emotionally significant. Distraction, in these moments, functions less as innocent entertainment and more as a sophisticated avoidance mechanism, one that feels harmless in any single instance, but accumulates into a significant pattern of avoidance across an entire lifetime. This understanding offers a powerful reframe that can transform how you relate to your own distracted impulses. Rather than simply trying to white-knuckle your way through resisting distraction through sheer willpower, you can instead become curious about what each impulse toward distraction is actually trying to help you avoid. This curiosity, practiced consistently, often reveals patterns about your own emotional life that prove far more valuable than the temporary relief that distraction itself provides. Let's talk about a man named James, whose story illustrates this principle of distraction as avoidance with particular clarity. James had been working for over a year on a creative project deeply important to him, something he genuinely wanted to complete and believed could meaningfully impact his career. Yet he found himself day after day sitting down with the intention of working on this project, only to find his attention repeatedly drawn toward checking news websites, browsing unrelated content, and engaging in a pattern of constant small distractions that prevented any meaningful progress. For a long time, James interpreted this pattern simply as laziness or a lack of discipline, criticizing himself harshly for failing to maintain focus on something he genuinely cared about. It was not until he began practicing the curiosity exercise described above, pausing each time he noticed the distraction impulse and asking himself honestly what he was avoiding, that he discovered something he had never previously recognized. He was not avoiding the work itself. He was avoiding the fear that his best, most genuine effort might still not be good enough. A fear so uncomfortable that distraction had become an unconscious strategy for never fully testing it. This realization did not instantly resolve James's distraction pattern, because fear that has been avoided for a long time rarely dissolves the moment it is named. But it gave James something he had never had before, an accurate understanding of the actual obstacle standing in his way, rather than continuing to fight a battle against laziness, which was never the genuine source of the problem. James could now address the actual fear directly, through honest reflection, through deliberately lowering the stakes he had attached to the project's outcome, and through gradually building tolerance for the discomfort of producing imperfect work rather than no work at all. This is the deeper promise of understanding the hidden cost of distraction. It is rarely simply about time management or willpower in the way most popular advice suggests. Genuine, lasting change in your relationship with distraction often requires understanding what specific discomfort each distraction pattern is helping you avoid, and then addressing that underlying discomfort directly, rather than simply trying to suppress the distracted behavior through force of will alone. Here is a practical exercise to begin applying this understanding immediately. Identify one specific pattern of distraction that recurs frequently in your own life, whether it is reaching for your phone during quiet moments, procrastinating on a particular type of task, or finding your attention pulled away during conversations that matter to you. For the next several days, each time you notice this specific pattern beginning, pause before acting on the impulse, and ask yourself honestly, what discomfort am I currently trying to avoid in this exact moment? Write down whatever answer arises without judgment, simply as an act of honest observation. Over several days of consistent practice, you will likely notice patterns emerging, specific types of discomfort, boredom, fear of inadequacy, anxiety about an uncertain outcome, loneliness that repeatedly trigger your distraction impulse. This awareness, exactly as we discussed in the previous chapter regarding mental noise, is the essential first step before any genuine, lasting change becomes possible. There is a phrase worth remembering as you move forward from this chapter, one that captures the essential truth we have explored. Distraction rarely steals your time directly. Distraction steals your presence, and your presence is the actual currency through which meaningful achievement, deep relationship, and genuine peace are purchased. Protecting your presence in your work, in your relationships, and in your own internal life is one of the most valuable investments you will ever make. As we move into the next chapter, we will shift our focus toward construction rather than diagnosis, exploring exactly how to build a mindset resilient enough to maintain focus and presence even amid the genuine chaos and unpredictability that life inevitably presents. You now understand the hidden costs of distraction with clear eyes. The next step is building the internal strength required to consistently choose focus and presence, even when circumstances make that choice genuinely difficult. Chapter 6. Building an unshakable mindset. There is a particular kind of person you have likely encountered at some point in your life, someone who seems to move through genuine adversity with a steadiness that appears almost mysterious. Not because their life contains less difficulty than anyone else's, but because difficulty, when it arrives, does not seem to shatter their fundamental sense of direction and purpose the way it shatters so many other people. They lose a job, and within a reasonable period of grieving, they begin building toward the next opportunity. They face a serious health challenge, and they find a way to maintain their sense of identity and purpose even within the limitations the challenge imposes. They experience a significant relationship loss, and eventually, they rebuild their capacity for connection rather than permanently closing themselves off out of fear. You might assume this kind of resilience is simply an inherited personality trait, something certain fortunate people are born with while others are not. But the actual research and lived experience surrounding human resilience tells a different, far more empowering story. Resilience, the capacity to maintain focus, direction, and emotional stability even amid genuine adversity, is overwhelmingly built rather than simply inherited. It is constructed through specific mental habits and patterns of focus that can be deliberately developed by anyone willing to invest the consistent effort required. This chapter is dedicated to exactly this construction process, building what we will call an unshakable mindset, not in the sense of a mindset immune to all difficulty or emotion, which would be neither realistic nor healthy, but in the sense of a mindset capable of maintaining its core direction and stability, even while genuinely experiencing the full range of human emotion that difficult circumstances naturally produce. Let's begin by examining a crucial distinction that often gets confused in popular conversations about resilience and positive thinking. An unshakable mindset is not about suppressing or denying difficult emotions. It is not about forcing yourself to feel happy when circumstances genuinely warrant grief, frustration, or fear. Attempting to bypass genuine emotional experience through forced positivity tends to backfire significantly, often producing emotions that simply go underground, only to resurface later with greater intensity, or manifesting as a kind of brittle, performative positivity that cracks easily under sustained pressure. A genuinely unshakable mindset operates differently. It allows for the full, honest experience of difficult emotions while maintaining a separate, parallel commitment to focus and direction that does not depend on those emotions disappearing first. This distinction matters enormously because it means you do not need to wait until you feel completely confident, completely at peace, or completely free of fear before you can maintain focus on what matters most. You can feel afraid and still maintain focus on your goal. You can feel grief and still maintain your sense of purpose. You can feel uncertain and still take consistent, deliberate action. This is perhaps the most liberating reframe available in this entire book, because so many people unconsciously believe they must first achieve some idealized emotional state, complete confidence, complete peace, complete clarity, before they are allowed to move forward with focus and purpose. This belief, while understandable, creates an impossible standard that very few people, if any, ever genuinely achieve. The most resilient, focused people you have ever admired were almost certainly not operating from a place of constant emotional perfection. They were operating from a willingness to maintain direction and focus, even while experiencing the same difficult emotions that affect every human being. Let's explore the actual mechanisms through which an unshakable mindset is built, because understanding these mechanisms will allow you to begin constructing this capacity deliberately, rather than waiting passively for it to develop on its own through the accumulation of difficult life experiences alone. The first mechanism involves something we will call anchor identity, a clear, stable sense of who you are and what you value that remains consistent regardless of external circumstances. Many people unconsciously construct their sense of identity primarily around external achievements, their job title, their financial status, their relationship status, their physical appearance. When identity is constructed this way, every external setback becomes a direct threat to the fundamental sense of self, because the identity and the external circumstance have become entangled rather than distinct. An unshakable mindset requires constructing identity around something more stable than external circumstances, around your core values, your character, and your chosen direction in life, things that remain true regardless of whether you currently have a job, a particular relationship status, or a specific level of achievement. This does not mean external achievements do not matter or should not be pursued with genuine effort. It means your fundamental sense of who you are should not depend entirely on those achievements remaining constant, because external circumstances, by their very nature, will inevitably fluctuate throughout any genuine human life. Consider a woman named Elena, who spent the majority of her adult life deeply identified with her career as a successful executive, a role that had become so thoroughly entangled with her sense of self that she rarely distinguished between the two. When a significant company restructuring eliminated her position after many years of dedicated service, Elena experienced something far more devastating than simple unemployment. She experienced what felt like the genuine collapse of her own identity. because the role she had lost was not simply a job to her. It had become, in her own mind, who she fundamentally was. It took Elena considerable time and significant internal work to rebuild her sense of identity around something more stable than her job title, around her core values of contributing meaningfully to the lives of others, her capacity for strategic thinking, her genuine care for the people she worked alongside throughout her career. Once she rebuilt her identity around these more stable internal qualities rather than the external role itself, she discovered something important. She could lose the specific job again, hypothetically, in the future. And while it would certainly be difficult and would warrant genuine grief, it would no longer threaten her fundamental sense of who she was, because who she was had become anchored in something far more durable than any particular external circumstance. This is the first practical step toward building an unshakable mindset, deliberately examining where your current sense of identity is anchored, and consciously shifting that anchor toward your core values, character, and chosen direction, rather than exclusively toward external circumstances that remain inherently outside your complete control. Here is an exercise to begin this examination honestly. Take a few quiet minutes and complete this sentence multiple times, generating as many different honest answers as you can. I am someone who. Notice how many of your answers reference external circumstances, your job, your relationship status, your financial situation, your physical appearance, versus how many reference internal qualities, your values, your character traits, your chosen ways of treating other people regardless of circumstance. If you notice your answers leaning heavily toward external circumstances, this is valuable information, not a cause for self-criticism, but useful awareness. Begin deliberately generating additional answers that reference internal, stable qualities. I am someone who values honesty even when it is difficult. I am someone who shows up consistently for people I care about. I am someone who continues learning and growing throughout my life. These internal anchors, practiced and reinforced consistently, become a far more stable foundation for your identity than any external circumstance could ever provide. The second mechanism for building an unshakable mindset involves what we will call the both-and principle, the deliberate practice of holding two seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously, rather than forcing yourself to choose only one. This is genuinely difficult for the human mind, which often prefers simple binary categorization: this is good or this is bad, this is working or this is failing. But genuine resilience requires the capacity to hold complexity, to recognize that a situation can be both genuinely difficult and simultaneously contain real opportunity for growth, that you can both feel afraid and still move forward with courage, that a setback can be both painful and ultimately serve a larger purpose you cannot yet fully see. This both-and capacity allows you to avoid two equally unproductive extremes that many people fall into during difficult circumstances. The first extreme is denial, forcing yourself to pretend a difficult situation is actually fine, suppressing genuine pain in favor of a forced, brittle positivity. The second extreme is collapse, allowing the difficulty of a situation to become the entire story, losing sight of any possibility for growth, meaning, or eventual resolution. The both-and principle allows you to hold the genuine difficulty honestly while simultaneously maintaining space for growth, possibility, and forward movement. The third mechanism, and perhaps the most directly practical of the three, involves deliberately building what we will call a resilience reservoir, a collection of evidence from your own life history, demonstrating your actual capacity to navigate difficulty successfully. Most people, when facing a new challenge, unconsciously focus their attention on reasons they might fail, reasons this particular difficulty might be insurmountable. This focus, consistent with everything we have explored throughout this book about where attention goes and what it produces, tends to generate exactly the anxiety and paralysis it fears, because attention directed toward potential failure strengthens neural pathways associated with fear and avoidance. Building a resilience reservoir involves deliberately and consistently directing your attention toward evidence of your own past capacity to navigate genuine difficulty, not through dishonest positive thinking that ignores real challenges, but through honest reflection, on actual moments throughout your life when you successfully moved through hardship that, at the time, felt genuinely overwhelming. Almost everyone, when they pause to honestly reflect, can identify multiple past experiences of difficulty they successfully navigated, even though, at the time, the outcome felt uncertain and the difficulty felt potentially insurmountable. Take a few minutes now to begin building your own resilience reservoir. Write down 3 specific instances from your own life when you faced something genuinely difficult, something that, at the time, felt uncertain or even overwhelming, and yet you found a way to move through it. These do not need to be dramatic or extraordinary circumstances. They simply need to be genuinely true moments from your own history. For each instance, write down specifically what internal qualities or external resources allowed you to navigate that difficulty successfully. This exercise builds something valuable beyond simple comfort. It builds an evidence-based counter-narrative to the automatic fear response that arises when facing new difficulty. Rather than facing a new challenge with only abstract hope that things might work out, you face it with concrete, specific evidence from your own actual life history, demonstrating your genuine capacity to navigate hardship. This evidence-based confidence is far more durable and far more useful than generic positive thinking disconnected from your own lived experience. Let's bring these 3 mechanisms together through the continued story of Elena, the executive who lost her long-held position. As Elena rebuilt her sense of identity around stable internal qualities rather than her external job title, she also began practicing the both and principle, allowing herself to genuinely grieve the loss of a role she had valued deeply, while simultaneously holding space for the possibility that this transition might eventually lead somewhere meaningful she could not yet fully see. And she deliberately built her resilience reservoir, reflecting honestly on previous career transitions and personal challenges she had successfully navigated earlier in her life, building concrete, evidence-based confidence in her own capacity to move through this current difficulty as well. Within approximately 18 months, Elena had built a consulting practice that drew on the exact same strategic skills she had developed throughout her executive career, but that offered her significantly greater flexibility and a renewed sense of purpose that, by her own honest account, exceeded what she had experienced even during the years of her previous, more conventionally prestigious position. This outcome was not guaranteed or inevitable. It required genuine, sustained effort and the willingness to sit with significant uncertainty for an extended period. But the unshakable mindset Elena deliberately constructed, anchored identity, the both and principle, and an evidence-based resilience reservoir, provided the internal foundation that made this eventual outcome possible, rather than allowing the initial setback to permanently derail her sense of direction and purpose. There is a phrase worth carrying forward from this chapter, one that captures the essential truth of an unshakable mindset. Resilience is not the absence of being shaken. Resilience is the presence of a foundation stable enough that even when you are genuinely shaken, you do not lose your direction entirely. You can experience the full, honest range of human emotion that difficult circumstances naturally produce, and still maintain your focus on the values, direction, and growth that matter most to you. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore one of the most powerful and underutilized tools available for actively directing your focus toward the future you want to build: the practice of vivid, intentional visualization. You now understand how to build the internal stability required to maintain focus amid difficulty. The next step is learning how to actively use that focus to mentally rehearse and accelerate the success you are working to create. Chapter 7. The Power of Visualization. Picture an Olympic diver standing at the edge of a platform, 10 meters above the water, preparing for a dive that will be judged in mere seconds, but has taken years of training to perfect. Before her body ever leaves the platform, watch her eyes close for a moment. Watch her body remain still, yet somehow you can sense movement happening within her, a kind of internal rehearsal taking place entirely inside her mind. She is not simply waiting nervously. She is performing the dive completely and precisely in her imagination before she ever performs it with her physical body. This is not a strange ritual or superstitious habit. This is one of the most extensively researched and consistently validated techniques in the entire field of performance psychology, used by elite athletes, world-renowned musicians, top-performing surgeons, and successful entrepreneurs across virtually every domain of human achievement. The technique is visualization, the deliberate, vivid mental rehearsal of a desired outcome, performed with such sensory detail and emotional engagement that the brain begins responding to the imagined experience in ways remarkably similar to how it would respond to the actual physical experience. This might sound almost too simple to be genuinely powerful, yet the underlying neuroscience reveals something remarkable about how the human brain actually functions. When you vividly imagine performing an action, whether physical, like a specific athletic movement, or more abstract, like delivering a confident presentation, many of the same neural pathways activate as would activate during the actual physical performance of that action. Your brain, in a very real and measurable sense, does not perfectly distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and an actual lived experience, at least not at the level of the neural firing patterns involved in skill execution and emotional response. This explains why visualization has become such a deeply integrated practice among elite performers across so many different fields. Athletes who mentally rehearse their performance, picturing every detail from the feeling of their muscles moving correctly to the emotional experience of confidence and focus during competition, often perform measurably better than those who rely solely on physical practice without this mental rehearsal component. Surgeons who mentally walk through complex procedures before performing them report greater precision and composure during the actual surgery. Public speakers who vividly rehearse confident, engaging presentations in their imagination consistently report reduced anxiety and improved actual performance when the real presentation arrives. But visualization extends far beyond simply rehearsing specific skills or performances. At its deepest and most powerful level, visualization functions as a tool for actively directing your focus toward the future you want to create, training your mind to recognize and move toward opportunities aligned with that envisioned future, rather than remaining stuck in old patterns shaped by past experience or current circumstance. This connects directly to everything explored in earlier chapters about how focus shapes perception and how thoughts shape reality. Visualization is, in a sense, the most concentrated and deliberate application of these principles, intentionally directing your mind's attention toward a specific future outcome, with enough vividness and emotional engagement to begin reshaping your present moment thoughts, beliefs, and actions. Let's examine how this actually works in practical terms, because understanding the mechanism will help you practice visualization effectively, rather than treating it as a vague, mystical exercise disconnected from genuine psychological principles. When you visualize a specific desired outcome vividly and repeatedly, several important things begin happening simultaneously within your mind and behavior. First, visualization begins to reshape your beliefs about what is actually possible for you. Remember from earlier chapters that beliefs are simply thoughts repeated often enough to feel like settled facts. When you repeatedly visualize yourself successfully navigating a challenging situation, confidently delivering an important presentation, calmly handling a difficult conversation, achieving a significant goal, you are essentially providing your mind with repeated evidence, even though that evidence originates from imagination rather than literal past experience, that this outcome is genuinely possible for you. Over time, with consistent practice, this repeated imagined evidence begins to shift your underlying beliefs about your own capability. The same way repeated real experience would shift those beliefs because your brain does not perfectly distinguish between the two at the neural level. Second, visualization trains your attention to notice opportunities aligned with your envisioned future that you might otherwise overlook entirely. Remember the earlier discussion of how focus determines perception, how two people can be surrounded by the exact same circumstances and notice entirely different things depending on where their attention is trained to look. When you consistently visualize a specific future outcome, your mind becomes increasingly attuned to noticing relevant opportunities, resources, and connections aligned with that outcome. Opportunities that were always present in your environment, but that your untrained attention might have simply filtered out as irrelevant noise. Third, visualization helps regulate the emotional state you bring into actual performance situations. When you have repeatedly rehearsed a confident, composed emotional state in connection with a particular challenge, that rehearsed emotional pattern becomes more accessible and more automatic when you actually face the real situation, rather than defaulting to whatever anxious or uncertain emotional pattern might otherwise arise automatically based on past experience or general nervousness. Let's bring this to life through a story that illustrates the practical power of visualization. Consider a young woman named Aisha, who had been invited to deliver a presentation to a room of senior executives, the largest and most significant speaking opportunity of her early career. Aisha had struggled with public speaking anxiety for years, and her initial instinct, consistent with this anxiety, was to avoid thinking about the upcoming presentation as much as possible, hoping that simply not dwelling on it would somehow reduce her nervousness when the day arrived. This avoidance strategy, unsurprisingly, did not work. As the presentation date approached, Aisha's anxiety intensified rather than diminished, precisely because her mind, left without any deliberate direction, defaulted to its habitual pattern of imagining worst-case scenarios, picturing herself stumbling over words, freezing under the scrutiny of senior leadership, being judged harshly by people whose opinion mattered significantly to her career trajectory. Without realizing it, Aisha had actually been visualizing failure repeatedly and vividly, simply through the natural, undirected wandering of an anxious mind. When Aisha learned about deliberate, structured visualization as a tool for performance preparation, she began a different practice entirely. Each day for the 2 weeks leading up to her presentation, she set aside 15 minutes to sit quietly and vividly imagine the entire experience unfolding successfully, with as much sensory and emotional detail as she could generate. She pictured herself walking into the room with calm confidence. She imagined the specific feeling of her feet on the floor, the weight of her notes in her hand, the sound of her own voice, clear and steady, as she began speaking. She visualized the executives in the room nodding with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that she answered with composure and clarity. Importantly, Aisha's visualization practice did not skip over the difficult moments entirely, pretending the experience would be free of any challenge. She also visualized herself encountering a difficult question she had not fully anticipated, and rather than imagining herself freezing in panic, she visualized herself taking a brief, composed pause, acknowledging the complexity of the question honestly, and responding thoughtfully even without having a perfectly polished answer prepared in advance. This detail mattered significantly because effective visualization is not about imagining an unrealistic, flawless fantasy. It is about rehearsing the emotional and behavioral response you actually want to bring into the real situation, including how you want to handle genuine challenges that might arise. When the day of the actual presentation arrived, Aisha reported something remarkable. The experience felt in a strange and difficult to fully articulate way, almost familiar, as though she had already lived through some version of this exact moment before. Her body remembered the calm, composed state she had been deliberately rehearsing for 2 weeks, and while she certainly still experienced some natural nervousness, that nervousness no longer escalated into the kind of overwhelming panic that had derailed her performance in previous, less prepared speaking situations. When an unexpected, challenging question did arise during the actual presentation, Aisha found herself responding with the same composed pause she had specifically rehearsed in her visualization practice, rather than the panicked freezing that might have occurred without that specific mental preparation. This story illustrates several important principles for practicing visualization effectively, principles worth understanding clearly before you begin applying this technique in your own life. Effective visualization requires genuine vividness, engaging as many senses as possible rather than simply forming a vague, abstract idea of a positive outcome. The more concretely you can imagine the sights, sounds, physical sensations, and emotions involved in your desired outcome, the more powerfully your brain engages with the visualization as something approaching real experience. Effective visualization also requires consistency, repeated practice over time, rather than a single attempt immediately before a high-stakes situation. Just as physical skill develops through repeated practice rather than a single training session, the neural pathways strengthened through visualization develop more robustly through consistent, repeated practice extended across days or weeks, rather than relying on a single last-minute attempt. And perhaps most importantly, effective visualization includes realistic challenges alongside the desired successful outcome, rather than imagining an idealized, conflict-free fantasy disconnected from genuine reality. This principle deserves particular emphasis because it represents a common mistake people make when first learning visualization techniques. Imagining only flawless, effortless success, without any acknowledgement of realistic obstacles, tends to produce a visualization that feels disconnected from reality, and that therefore fails to build the genuine confidence and behavioral rehearsal that visualization is actually capable of providing when practiced more realistically. Let's explore a structured approach you can begin applying immediately to your own life, regardless of what specific outcome you are working to achieve. This approach can be applied to upcoming events, like Aisha's presentation, but it can equally be applied to longer-term goals and aspirations that extend across months or years, rather than a single specific event. Begin by finding a quiet space where you will not be interrupted for at least 10 to 15 minutes. Close your eyes and allow your breathing to settle into a calm, steady rhythm. Begin by clearly identifying the specific outcome you want to visualize, whether a specific upcoming event or a broader life goal you are working toward. Once you have this outcome clearly in mind, begin building the visualization with as much sensory detail as possible. If you are visualizing a specific event, imagine the physical environment in detail, what you see around you, what you hear, what you physically feel in your body. Imagine yourself moving through the experience successfully, paying particular attention to your emotional state, confidence, calm, focus, rather than simply imagining external events unfolding favorably without attention to your internal experience. Include at least one realistic challenge within your visualization, and specifically rehearse responding to that challenge with the composed, capable response you want to actually demonstrate in real life. This detail, as illustrated by Aisha's story, often makes the difference between a visualization that produces genuine behavioral change and one that remains a pleasant but ultimately ineffective daydream, disconnected from real preparation. Practice this visualization consistently, ideally daily, for at least several days leading up to a specific event, or as an ongoing daily practice if you are visualizing a longer-term goal rather than a single specific occasion. Consistency matters significantly more than the length of any individual session. Even 5 to 10 minutes of genuinely vivid, focused visualization practiced consistently will produce far greater results than occasional, lengthy sessions practiced inconsistently. There is one additional dimension of visualization worth exploring before we conclude this chapter, a dimension that extends beyond rehearsing specific events into the broader practice of visualizing your desired future identity, the kind of person you are working to become across the full scope of your life, not simply within a single isolated situation. This broader identity visualization involves regularly imagining yourself already embodying the qualities, habits, and characteristics of the person you are working to become, whether that involves confidence, discipline, generosity, creative courage, or any other quality genuinely important to your envisioned future. This identity-level visualization connects powerfully with the principle explored in earlier chapters regarding how repeated thought reshapes neural pathways and underlying belief. When you consistently visualize yourself as someone who already embodies your desired qualities, rather than someone who is still working to develop them at some uncertain point in the future, you begin closing the psychological gap between your current self-concept and your envisioned future self, making the actual behavioral changes required to embody that future self feel significantly more natural and accessible in your daily life. There is a memorable principle worth carrying forward from this chapter, one that captures the essential power of visualization. The mind cannot fully distinguish between vividly imagined experience and literal lived experience, which means every moment you spend in deliberate, vivid visualization of your desired future is, in a very real sense, already beginning to build that future within the architecture of your own brain, long before it ever becomes visible in your external circumstances. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore how everything we have covered so far, the focus formula, the defeat of mental noise, the building of an unshakable mindset, and the practice of vivid visualization, comes together to directly determine the level of success you experience across your career and financial life. You now understand how to mentally rehearse the future you want. The next step is understanding precisely how focus translates into the tangible, measurable success that builds the life you envision. Chapter 8. Focus and Success. There is a question worth sitting with honestly before we move further into this chapter, a question that cuts through much of the noise surrounding popular conversations about success and achievement. When you examine the people you genuinely consider successful, not necessarily famous or wealthy in some superficial sense, but truly successful in building a meaningful career, a thriving business, or significant mastery within their chosen field, what single quality do they almost universally share? Beneath whatever surface-level differences exist in their specific talents, backgrounds, or circumstances. If you examine closely enough, beyond the surface stories of luck or natural talent that often get emphasized in simplified success narratives, you will almost always find the same underlying pattern. An extraordinary capacity for sustained, directed focus, applied consistently over an extended period of time, toward a clearly defined area of mastery or achievement. This is not a coincidence, and it is not simply one factor among many equally important factors. Sustained, directed focus is the primary engine through which virtually all significant achievement is actually constructed, regardless of the specific field or domain involved. Consider the popular narrative surrounding overnight success stories. The entrepreneur whose company suddenly seems to explode into prominence. The artist whose work suddenly captures widespread attention. The professional who suddenly receives a significant promotion or opportunity that appears to transform their career trajectory overnight. These narratives, while compelling and often genuinely inspiring, almost always obscure a far less dramatic but far more important truth. Beneath nearly every apparent overnight success lies years, often a full decade or more, of sustained, focused effort that occurred largely outside public visibility. Effort that the eventual dramatic breakthrough simply made visible to an audience that had not been paying attention during the actual years of construction. This matters enormously for how you think about your own pursuit of success, because the popular overnight success narrative, left unexamined, can produce a deeply discouraging and inaccurate framework for understanding your own progress. If you believe genuine success typically arrives suddenly, through some combination of luck and natural talent, then years of consistent, focused effort that have not yet produced dramatic external results can feel like evidence of failure. Evidence that you simply do not have what it takes, rather than what they actually represent. The normal, necessary accumulation phase that precedes virtually every genuine achievement that later appears from the outside as a sudden breakthrough. Let's examine the actual mechanism through which sustained focus translates into success, because understanding this mechanism precisely will help you maintain confidence and direction during the often lengthy accumulation phase that precedes visible external results. This mechanism involves what we might call compound skill development, a process remarkably similar to how financial compound interest works, where consistent focused effort produces results that accelerate over time rather than accumulating in a simple linear fashion. When you sustain focused attention on developing a particular skill or building toward a particular goal, your competence in that area does not simply add up in a straightforward, predictable manner. Instead, each increment of skill or knowledge builds upon previous increments in ways that create accelerating returns. Early skill development often feels frustratingly slow because you are building foundational understanding that does not yet produce dramatic, visible results. But as foundational competence accumulates, each additional unit of focused effort begins producing increasingly significant results, because that effort is now building upon an increasingly sophisticated foundation rather than starting from nothing. This explains why the early stages of pursuing any significant goal, building a business, developing expertise in a demanding field, mastering a complex skill, often feel disproportionately difficult and discouraging relative to the visible progress achieved. You are in the foundational phase of compound development, where the actual underlying growth is genuine and significant, but the visible external results have not yet caught up to reflect that underlying growth. Many people abandon their pursuit during exactly this phase, precisely because the discouraging gap between effort invested and visible results achieved feels like clear evidence that the pursuit is not working. When in reality, it is simply the normal, necessary, often lengthy foundational phase that precedes the accelerating returns that compound development eventually produces for those who maintain focused effort long enough to reach that later phase. Let's bring this principle to life through a detailed story that illustrates both the difficulty of the early foundational phase and the eventual accelerating returns that sustained focus produces. Consider a man named Thomas, who decided in his late 20s to pursue mastery in a highly competitive creative field, photography, specifically the demanding subspecialty of architectural and commercial photography that required not only technical mastery, but also significant business development skill to build a sustainable career. For the first 3 years of Thomas's pursuit, the visible external results were genuinely discouraging. He struggled to find clients willing to pay meaningful rates for his work. His technical skills, while improving, remained noticeably behind established professionals he admired and hoped to eventually compete alongside. Multiple times during these early years, Thomas seriously considered abandoning the pursuit entirely, returning to a more conventional, stable career path that friends and family frequently suggested would provide greater security and more immediate, visible reward for his effort. What kept Thomas continuing through this discouraging early phase was not blind optimism disconnected from reality, but rather a specific understanding, learned through studying the career trajectories of photographers he deeply admired, that this foundational phase of slow, often invisible skill accumulation was simply the necessary universal cost of entry into genuine mastery within any demanding creative field. He maintained sustained, focused effort, deliberately practicing specific technical skills, studying the work of photographers whose mastery he hoped to eventually approach, and consistently seeking out whatever client opportunities were available, even when those early opportunities offered minimal financial compensation relative to the time and effort invested. By Thomas's 5th year of sustained focus pursuit, something began shifting that felt from the outside remarkably similar to the dramatic overnight success narratives that obscure the actual mechanism of achievement. His technical skill, accumulated through years of focused, deliberate practice, had reached a level where his work began genuinely distinguishing itself within his competitive field. His business development skill, also accumulated through years of focused effort despite early discouraging results, had built a network of professional relationships and a reputation that began generating consistent client referrals without the constant, exhausting effort required during his earlier years. By his 7th year, Thomas was operating a thriving photography business, working with clients he had once considered far beyond his reach, earning income that would have seemed almost unimaginable during his discouraging early years. From the outside, particularly to people who had not witnessed his earlier years of sustained, often invisible effort, this success might have appeared to arrive suddenly, the result of fortunate timing or natural talent finally being recognized. But Thomas understood with complete clarity that this apparent sudden success was actually the visible manifestation of 7 years of sustained, focused effort that had been quietly compounding throughout the entire period, even during the years when visible external results provided little evidence of the genuine underlying growth occurring beneath the surface. This story illustrates a principle essential to understanding the relationship between focus and success, a principle worth holding on to with particular firmness during any period in your own life when sustained effort has not yet produced the visible external results you hope to eventually achieve. Compound development is real, and it operates reliably for virtually anyone who maintains sustained, focused effort over a sufficiently extended period, but it requires patience and continued commitment through a foundational phase that almost universally feels more difficult and more discouraging than the eventual accelerating returns that phase makes possible. This brings us to a practical and essential question. How do you maintain sustained focus through this often lengthy and discouraging foundational phase, particularly when visible external feedback provides little immediate evidence that your effort is genuinely working? This question connects directly back to several principles explored in earlier chapters, particularly the focus formula's emphasis on emotional investment and the visualization practices explored in the previous chapter. First, maintaining sustained focus through a discouraging foundational phase requires deliberately tracking internal, process-based progress rather than relying exclusively on external, outcome-based feedback. Thomas, during his early discouraging years, kept a detailed record of specific technical skills he was developing, specific lessons learned from each project regardless of its financial outcome, and specific professional relationships he was building, even when those relationships had not yet produced significant financial return. This internal tracking provided genuine evidence of real progress, evidence that helped counter the discouragement that purely external, outcome-based measurement would have produced during years when visible financial and reputational results remained minimal. Second, maintaining sustained focus through this phase requires the kind of clearly defined target and emotional investment described in the focus formula chapter. A target specific and meaningful enough to sustain motivation, even when immediate results remain limited. Thomas's commitment to his photography career was not connected to abstract notions of success in general, but to specific, deeply meaningful reasons: a genuine love of the creative craft itself, a desire to build a career that offered creative autonomy he had not experienced in previous, more conventional work, and a specific vision of the kind of life and work he wanted to build for himself, and eventually for a family he hoped to support. Third, maintaining sustained focus through this discouraging phase benefits enormously from the visualization practices explored in the previous chapter, regularly and vividly imagining the eventual successful outcome of sustained effort, not as a replacement for the actual effort itself, but as a tool for maintaining the emotional energy and belief required to continue investing that effort consistently, even when external evidence remains limited. Let's examine one additional principle essential to understanding the relationship between focus and success, a principle that addresses a common misunderstanding about what sustained focus actually requires. Sustained focus toward significant success does not require constant, unbroken intensity, working every waking hour with no rest or recovery. This misunderstanding has led many people toward unsustainable patterns of effort that eventually produce burnout, undermining the very sustained focus required for genuine compound development over the extended periods actually necessary for significant achievement. Genuine sustained focus, the kind that produces compound development over years rather than burning out within months, requires a sustainable rhythm of focused effort and genuine recovery, rather than constant, unbroken intensity. This is why many of the most successful people across various fields emphasize the importance of rest, recovery, and boundaries around their work, not as luxuries indulged in despite their success, but as essential components of the sustainable focus that actually made their long-term success possible in the first place. Burnout represents a genuine threat to sustained focus, not because rest and recovery are signs of weakness, but because the human capacity for focused attention, like any other resource, requires genuine replenishment to remain available over the extended time frames that significant achievement actually requires. There is a phrase worth carrying forward from this chapter, one that captures the essential relationship between focus and success. Success is rarely the result of a single dramatic moment of brilliance or luck. Success is almost always the visible result of invisible focus, sustained consistently over a period far longer than most people are willing to imagine, let alone endure. The question that actually determines whether you achieve significant success in your chosen pursuit is not whether you possess sufficient talent or sufficient luck. The question is whether you can maintain sustained, focused effort through the often lengthy and discouraging foundational phase that precedes the accelerating returns, compound development eventually produces. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore how this same principle of sustained, directed focus applies not only to career and financial success, but equally to the depth and quality of your most important relationships. You now understand how focus builds external achievement. The next step is understanding how focus builds the internal connection and intimacy that determine the quality of your most significant relationships. Chapter 9. Focus and relationships. There is a particular moment that occurs in countless relationships, a moment that often arrives quietly, without any dramatic announcement, yet carries enormous significance for everything that follows. It is the moment when one person, in the middle of sharing something genuinely important to them, looks up and notices that the person they are talking to is not actually present, eyes glazed slightly, attention drifting toward a phone, a television, or simply an internal preoccupation that has nothing to do with the conversation actually happening. In that single moment, something subtle but real is communicated, whether intended or not. What I am sharing right now does not deserve your full attention. No relationship, regardless of how much genuine love exists between the two people involved, can fully thrive when this moment repeats often enough to become a defining pattern rather than an occasional, forgivable lapse. This is perhaps the single most important and most underappreciated truth about how focus determines the quality of your relationships. Love, while genuinely necessary, is not actually sufficient on its own to build deep, thriving connection. Love must be expressed through sustained, genuine attention, because attention is the actual currency through which love becomes tangibly experienced by another person, rather than remaining simply an internal feeling that the other person has no reliable way of directly perceiving. Consider how you actually experience feeling loved and valued by another person in your own life. Is it primarily through grand declarations or occasional significant gestures? Or is it more fundamentally through the accumulated experience of feeling genuinely seen, heard, and attended to during the countless ordinary moments that make up the actual texture of daily life together? For most people, when they reflect honestly, the answer points clearly toward the latter. The feeling of being loved is built far more through consistent, genuine attention during ordinary moments than through occasional dramatic gestures, however meaningful those gestures might also be. This principle reframes how you should think about investing in your most important relationships, whether romantic partnerships, friendships, or family connections. Rather than primarily focusing on occasional grand gestures, though these certainly have their place, the deeper, more foundational work of building thriving relationships involves the consistent, deliberate practice of focused, genuine attention during the countless ordinary interactions that occur throughout daily life. Conversations during meals, brief check-ins throughout a busy day, the quality of presence you bring during moments of both celebration and difficulty. Let's examine what genuinely focused attention in relationships actually requires, because this concept, while intuitively understandable, deserves more precise examination than it typically receives in casual conversation. Focused attention in a relational context involves several specific components working together. It involves genuinely listening to understand, rather than simply waiting for your turn to speak or formulating your response before the other person has even finished sharing their thoughts. It involves noticing and responding to subtle emotional cues, the slight change in tone, the brief pause that suggests something significant beneath the surface of what is being explicitly said. And it involves consciously setting aside competing distractions, internal preoccupations, external devices, during moments when another person is genuinely sharing something meaningful with you. Each of these components requires deliberate practice, because the default, untrained state of human attention, as we explored in earlier chapters regarding mental noise and distraction, tends naturally toward fragmentation rather than sustained focus. This means that genuine relational attention, like every other form of focus explored throughout this book, is a skill that must be deliberately developed rather than something that simply happens automatically whenever you happen to be in the physical presence of someone you care about. Let's bring this principle to life through a story that illustrates both the cost of fragmented attention in relationships and the transformative power of deliberately rebuilding focused presence. Consider a married couple, David and Maria, who had been together for over 15 years, raising 2 children while both maintaining demanding careers. From the outside, their marriage appeared stable and functional. No dramatic conflicts, no obvious crisis that would have prompted concerned intervention from friends or family. Yet privately, both David and Maria had begun experiencing a quiet, persistent loneliness within their marriage, a sense of growing distance that neither could fully articulate or explain, given that no specific dramatic event had caused it. When they finally sought guidance to understand this growing distance, what emerged through careful examination was not any single dramatic betrayal or conflict, but rather an accumulated pattern of fragmented attention that had developed gradually over years, almost imperceptibly, until it had become the dominant texture of their daily interaction. Dinner conversations had gradually become opportunities for both David and Maria to check their phones between bites, rather than genuine spaces for connection and shared presence. Their brief moments together before sleep each night had become consumed by parallel scrolling through separate devices rather than genuine conversation or connection. Even their conversations about significant family matters had become increasingly transactional, focused on logistics and scheduling, rather than genuine emotional sharing and mutual understanding. Neither David nor Maria had consciously decided to create this pattern. It had simply accumulated gradually, the natural result of 2 genuinely busy people allowing the default pull of modern distraction to consume the attention that had once flowed naturally toward each other during the earlier years of their relationship. Before children, demanding careers and the constant availability of digital distraction had begun competing for the attention that sustained their connection. The path back toward genuine connection for David and Maria did not require any single dramatic gesture or grand romantic event. It required something far more challenging in certain respects: the consistent, deliberate rebuilding of focused attention during the ordinary moments that had gradually become fragmented. They began with a specific, concrete commitment, 20 minutes each evening after their children were asleep, completely free of phones or other devices, dedicated exclusively to genuine conversation and shared presence. This might sound like a small, almost insignificant commitment, given the depth of disconnection they had been experiencing. But the actual experience of practicing this consistently revealed something important about the principle explored throughout this book. Small amounts of genuinely focused attention, practiced consistently, produce far greater impact than occasional large gestures practiced inconsistently. Within several weeks of this consistent practice, both David and Maria reported a noticeable shift in how connected they felt throughout their entire relationship, not simply during the 20 minutes of dedicated device-free time itself. This shift makes sense when examined through the principles explored throughout this book. The 20 minutes of genuinely focused attention each evening functioned somewhat like the strength training exercises discussed in earlier chapters, deliberately strengthening a neural pathway and a relational habit that had weakened through years of disuse. As this pathway strengthened through consistent practice, the quality of attention David and Maria brought to each other began naturally extending beyond just the dedicated 20 minutes, into other moments throughout their days together as well, because the skill of focused presence, like any skill, becomes more naturally accessible the more consistently it is practiced. This story illustrates a principle essential to understanding how focus shapes relationship quality, a principle worth examining carefully because it offers genuine hope to anyone who feels their important relationships have drifted toward a similar pattern of fragmented attention. The repair of disconnected relationships rarely requires a single dramatic transformation. It requires the consistent, deliberate rebuilding of focused attention during specific, concrete moments, practiced with enough consistency that this rebuilt capacity for presence gradually extends into the broader texture of the relationship as a whole. Let's explore several specific, practical practices for bringing more genuine focus into your important relationships, building on the principle illustrated through David and Maria's experience. The first practice involves what we might call device-free anchors, specific, consistently protected windows of time even relatively brief windows, during which devices and other competing distractions are deliberately set aside in favor of genuine presence with someone important to you. These anchors work most powerfully when they occur consistently, at the same time, or within the same routine, rather than only happening occasionally and unpredictably. The second practice involves deliberately practicing what is sometimes called reflective listening, a specific technique that strengthens genuine attentive presence during conversation. Rather than simply listening passively while internally formulating your response, reflective listening involves periodically pausing to genuinely summarize or reflect back what you have heard the other person express, both the factual content and the emotional undertone, before offering your own response or perspective. This practice, while initially feeling somewhat unnatural or even unnecessarily formal, builds the habit of genuinely absorbing what another person is communicating, rather than the far more common default pattern of half-listening while mentally preparing your next contribution to the conversation. The third practice involves deliberately noticing and naming moments of genuine connection when they occur, rather than allowing them to pass unmarked and therefore less likely to be remembered or reinforced. When you experience a moment of genuine connection with someone important to you, a shared laugh, a moment of mutual understanding during a difficult conversation, a feeling of warmth during an ordinary shared activity, briefly acknowledging that moment, even silently to yourself, strengthens your attention's tendency to notice and value these moments of connection, making you more likely to notice similar opportunities for connection in the future. There is an additional dimension of focus and relationships worth exploring before concluding this chapter, a dimension that extends beyond romantic partnerships into the broader network of relationships that contribute meaningfully to a genuinely fulfilling life, friendships, family connections, and professional relationships built on genuine mutual respect and care. The same principles explored through David and Maria's story apply equally across all of these relationship categories. Genuine connection, in any relationship, is built through the accumulation of focused, attentive presence during both significant and ordinary shared moments, rather than primarily through occasional grand gestures disconnected from the consistent texture of daily interaction. This has an important implication worth considering honestly. If you find yourself feeling a vague sense of disconnection or loneliness within relationships that should, in theory, provide meaningful connection, it is worth examining honestly how much genuine, focused attention you have actually been bringing to those relationships recently, separate from whatever genuine love or care you continue to feel internally. As explored throughout this chapter, love that remains purely internal, without being consistently expressed through focused attention, often fails to produce the felt experience of connection that both people in any relationship genuinely need and deserve. There is a phrase worth carrying forward from this chapter, one that captures the essential truth of how focus shapes relationship quality. The people you love do not experience your love as an abstract internal feeling you carry within yourself. They experience your love through the quality of attention you actually bring to your shared moments together. Wherever your focus goes within your relationships, connection flows. And wherever your focus consistently drifts away, even while love continues to exist internally, connection inevitably begins to fade. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore how the cumulative effect of everything covered so far, your focus on success, on relationships, on the internal management of your own mind, ultimately shapes something even more fundamental: the actual identity you carry into the world and the story you tell yourself about who you fundamentally are. You now understand how focus builds connection with others. The next step is understanding how focus builds, or potentially limits, your connection with your own deepest sense of self. Chapter 10. Reprogramming your identity. There is a question that, once genuinely asked, has the power to quietly rearrange everything you thought you understood about lasting change. The question is this: when you try to build a new habit, pursue a new goal, or break free from an old limitation, are you actually trying to change what you do? Or are you actually trying to change who you believe yourself to be? Most people, without realizing it, spend years trying to change behavior while leaving the underlying identity completely untouched, and then feel confused when the new behavior never quite sticks. when the old patterns keep pulling them back no matter how much willpower they apply. Identity is the quiet, often unconscious answer to a single question you ask yourself thousands of times throughout your life, without ever phrasing it explicitly. Who am I? Every action you take is, in some sense, a vote for a particular answer to that question. And here is the part that connects everything in this book together with striking clarity. The thoughts you have repeated most consistently throughout your life, the focus you have habitually maintained or allowed to scatter, have been quietly writing and rewriting the answer to that question for as long as you have been alive, usually without your conscious participation in the process at all. Consider how identity actually forms. A child is told repeatedly that she is the responsible one in the family, and within a few years, this becomes not simply something said about her, but something she believes about herself, something she then acts in accordance with for decades, often long after the original context that produced the label has disappeared entirely. A young man fails at an early athletic attempt, internalizes the conclusion that he is simply not athletic, and spends the rest of his life avoiding physical challenges that might have revealed a very different truth had he approached them with a different internal narrative. Identity, in both cases, was not chosen deliberately. It was assembled almost accidentally out of repeated thoughts and repeated focus, exactly the mechanism explored throughout this entire book. This means identity is reprogrammable, using the same fundamental principle that has run through every chapter so far. Repeated, focused thought shapes neural pathways, shapes belief, and eventually shapes the felt sense of who you are. If your current identity was built through years of unconscious repetition, a new, more empowering identity can be built through years, or in many cases far less time than you might expect, of conscious, deliberate repetition. Consider a woman named Renata, who for most of her adult life identified herself privately as someone who was simply not creative, a label she had absorbed early in school after a teacher's careless comparison to a more naturally artistic classmate. For over 20 years, Renata avoided anything that might test this belief, declining invitations to creative projects, dismissing her own occasional creative impulses as silly or unrealistic before they ever had a chance to develop. It was not until a season of genuine personal upheaval, a divorce that forced her to rebuild much of her daily life from scratch, that Renata finally had the space and motivation to question whether this 20-year-old identity was actually accurate, or simply a conclusion she had repeated so many times it had calcified into something that felt permanent. Renata began small, deliberately practicing a new internal narrative each day, writing the words "I'm someone who creates" in a journal each morning, then taking one small action afterward that aligned with that statement, even something as modest as a 15-minute sketch or a few paragraphs of writing. At first, this felt deeply uncomfortable, almost dishonest because it directly contradicted the identity she had carried for 2 decades. But she understood, from principles very similar to those explored throughout this book, that discomfort during this kind of identity reconstruction is normal and expected, evidence that an old, well-established neural pathway is being challenged, rather than evidence that the new identity is somehow false. Within a year, something had genuinely shifted. Renata was not simply occasionally creative. She had built, through consistent repetition of both thought and small daily action, a genuinely new sense of self that she now inhabited as naturally as she had once inhabited her old, limiting identity. This is the precise mechanism through which identity reprogramming works, and it deserves to be stated as clearly as possible. You do not wait until you feel like a different kind of person before acting differently. You act in small, consistent alignment with the identity you want to build, repeatedly, and the felt sense of that identity follows the repeated action and thought, often more slowly than you would like, but as reliably as anything explored in this book. Here is a practical exercise for beginning this work in your own life. Identify one limiting identity statement you have carried for years, something you have said about yourself so often it feels like simple fact rather than an old, unexamined conclusion. Write a new identity statement to replace it, phrased in the present tense as though it is already true. Each morning for the next 30 days, write this new statement down and follow it with one small, concrete action that provides genuine evidence for that new identity, however modest that action might feel at first. There is a phrase worth carrying forward from this chapter. You do not think your way into a new identity and then act accordingly. You act your way into a new identity, one small, repeated piece of evidence at a time, until the new identity becomes simply who you are, the same quiet, automatic way your old limiting identity once felt like simple, unquestionable fact. Chapter 11. The Daily Focus System. Everything explored throughout this book converges into a single practical question that determines whether any of it actually changes your life or simply remains interesting information you once encountered. How do you structure an ordinary day so that your focus is deliberately directed rather than left to drift wherever distraction and habit happen to pull it? Understanding is necessary, but understanding alone has never built a single meaningful achievement or repaired a single fractured relationship. Only consistent, structured daily practice does that work. This chapter offers a complete, repeatable daily system, designed not as a rigid set of rules, but as a flexible structure you can adapt to your own circumstances, built around the principles explored in every previous chapter. The system contains 5 components, each addressing a different aspect of focus management explored throughout this book. The first component is the morning anchor, a brief period, ideally no more than 10 to 15 minutes, practiced before the demands of the day have a chance to scatter your attention. During this anchor, you clarify your primary focus for the day, using the specificity principle from the focus formula chapter, and you spend a few minutes in vivid visualization, briefly rehearsing how you want to show up, particularly during any challenging situations you anticipate facing that day. This single practice, protected consistently, sets the direction of your attention before external forces have the opportunity to set it for you instead. The second component is the noise audit, practiced briefly at midday, a moment to pause and honestly notice what mental noise has accumulated since the morning, applying the awareness practices from the chapter on defeating mental noise. This does not require extensive time, simply a few minutes of honest internal observation, followed by a brief redirection back toward your stated primary focus for the day. The third component is the presence practice, a deliberate commitment to at least one period of fully focused, device-free attention given to a person who matters to you, applying the principles explored in the relationships chapter. This might be a meal, a conversation, or simply a brief check-in, but it must be genuinely protected from competing distraction. The fourth component is the deep work block, a protected period, ideally at least 60 to 90 minutes, dedicated entirely to your most important focused work for that day, free from notifications and interruptions, applying the understanding of attention residue and compound development explored in the chapters on distraction and success. This is the block where the actual accumulation of meaningful progress occurs, and protecting it consistently is often the single highest leverage practice available to you. The fifth and final component is the evening reflection, a brief review before sleep, examining where your focus actually went that day compared to where you intended it to go, identifying one specific insight or adjustment for tomorrow, and reinforcing your evolving identity through a brief moment of gratitude or acknowledgement for the focused choices you did successfully make, however imperfect the day might have been overall. Consider a man named Victor, who had read extensively about productivity and personal development for years without experiencing significant lasting change in his daily life. When he finally implemented this 5-component structure consistently, beginning with just the morning anchor and the deep work block before gradually adding the remaining components over several weeks, he reported something he had not experienced despite years of consuming personal development content. His days began to feel less like a reaction to whatever happened to demand his attention, and more like something he was actively constructing with intention. The key insight Victor discovered, one worth emphasizing clearly, is that this system does not require perfection to produce genuine results. Missing a component on a particular day, or executing it imperfectly, does not erase the value of the days when it was practiced consistently. The compound development explored in the success chapter applies here as well. Consistent, imperfect practice over months produces far greater transformation than occasional, perfect execution attempted only when conditions feel ideal. Here is your exercise for this chapter. Choose just one component of this 5-part system to implement consistently for the next 7 days, ideally the morning anchor or the deep work block, since these tend to produce the most immediate, noticeable impact. Resist the temptation to implement all 5 components simultaneously, since this often produces an unsustainable burst of motivation that collapses within days. Build one habit solidly before adding the next. There is a phrase worth carrying forward from this chapter. A life of focus is not built through occasional heroic effort. It is built through an ordinary structure, practiced on ordinary days, until that structure becomes simply how you live, rather than something you have to remember to do. Chapter 12. Where focus goes, power flows. You have traveled a long way since the opening pages of this book, through the architecture of your own mind, through the mechanisms by which thought becomes reality, through the formula that transforms scattered effort into directed power, through the quieting of noise and the defeat of distraction, through the construction of a mindset that holds steady under pressure, through the rehearsal of futures not yet lived, through the long, patient accumulation that builds genuine success, through the attention that builds genuine connection, and through the deliberate reconstruction of the very identity you carry into the world each day. Now we arrive back at the single sentence that has quietly anchored every chapter, the sentence worth carrying with you long after you finish this final page. Where focus goes, power flows. This is not a clever phrase designed simply to sound inspiring. It is the most accurate, most practical description available of how human potential actually becomes human achievement, how invisible thought becomes visible reality, how a life of scattered drifting becomes a life of deliberate, meaningful direction. Think back to the very beginning of this journey, to the image of standing at the edge of your own life, looking back at decisions that seemed to simply happen to you, rather than decisions you consciously made. You now understand something that changes the entire meaning of that image. Those decisions were never random. They were the direct, traceable result of where your attention lived, moment after moment, day after day, year after year. And this understanding, rather than producing regret over time you cannot recover, is meant to produce something far more valuable, a clear, undeniable sense of your own power to direct everything that comes next. You have learned that your mind is not simply where your life is experienced, but where it is actually constructed. Thought by repeated thought. You have learned that the gap between the life you currently have and the life you actually want is rarely a gap of opportunity or talent, and is almost always a gap of focus, scattered across distraction, worry, and unexamined belief rather than concentrated toward what genuinely matters. You have learned that this gap can close, not through one dramatic transformation, but through the patient, consistent, daily redirection of your attention, practiced until it becomes who you are, rather than something you occasionally remember to attempt. Consider one final time the two people standing at the same starting line that opened this book's deeper exploration in the early chapters. The only meaningful difference between a life that flourishes and a life that quietly stalls is rarely talent, rarely luck, and rarely circumstance. It is focus, sustained long enough, directed clearly enough, and protected fiercely enough from the constant pull of modern distraction to allow genuine power to accumulate where it was deliberately placed. This is your invitation, not to read one more inspiring book and set it aside until the next one arrives, but to begin, today, in this very hour, redirecting your attention toward the life you have been capable of building this entire time. Choose one chapter, one principle, one practice from everything you have just absorbed, and apply it before the day ends. Not because perfection is required, but because the version of you who takes one small, focused action today is already a different person than the version who simply finishes a book and moves on unchanged. Somewhere ahead of you, closer than you might currently believe, is a version of your life built entirely on the foundation of directed attention, rather than accidental drifting. A career that reflects your true capability. relationships built on genuine, sustained presence rather than fractured half-attention, an identity anchored in values and capability rather than circumstance, a mind quiet enough to hear its own wisdom rather than drowned in constant noise. That life is not waiting on permission, and it is not waiting on perfect circumstances. It is waiting on the same thing it has always been waiting on. Your focus, finally, fully, deliberately directed toward it. Where focus goes, power flows. Let this be the last sentence you remember, not as something you once read, but as something you now live. Your attention is the most valuable resource you will ever possess, more valuable than any amount of money, more powerful than any stroke of luck. Place it with intention, protect it with discipline, and direct it toward the life only you are capable of building. The world is waiting to see what you create once you finally, fully, take command of where your focus goes. This is not the end of your journey. This is the beginning of the only journey that has ever truly mattered, the journey back to the full command of your own mind, and through it, the full command of your own life.